Hi, my name is Dukedobbins FTW, and I'm a recovering video game addict. At my worst, I was playing Overwatch 15 hours a day for months on end, and getting into shouting matches with 13-year-old girls because I was hogging their favorite character. I'd been this addicted to gaming once before, back on MW2, and things had gotten so bad then that one day my high school girlfriend, furious I wasn't paying enough attention to her, ripped the game disc from its tray and snapped it in half right in front of me, screaming like a hyena. Livid, with tears streaming from my eyes, I sprinted to the bathroom, grabbed her favorite $150 straightener, and smashed it on the ground. But this did not bring back my MW2 disc, and so I had no choice but to get clean. But this time around, I'd bought Overwatch digitally, so there was nothing to stop me. Things spiraled out of control, and Jeff made me his bitch for nearly 2 years. When I finally snapped out of it, nothing was the same. Now I'm supposed to list for you all the horrible consequences I had to deal with after doing nothing but playing video games for 18 months. All about how it ruined my relationship, my health, my finances, right? Wrong! I fucking love video games and I regret nothing. Because the truth is, gaming gave me an intrinsic satisfaction and sense of fulfillment that I wasn't getting in real life. That I couldn't help but gravitate towards even though I knew I was supposed to be doing something else. And apparently, I'm not the only one who feels this way. That same year, a study from Princeton University found there's an epidemic of young men opting out of the workforce to stay home and play video games all day. And more surprisingly, it found that despite consequences such as lower incomes and having to live with their parents, subjects still reported higher levels of life satisfaction and happiness compared to their working counterparts. This trend continued into 2019, and the economic fallout from COVID is likely to accelerate it going forward. Naturally, this has alarmed economists who don't understand why people aren't more excited about their 9-to-5s. Unsurprisingly, there are growing concerns about video game addiction in the classroom as well, particularly when so many students are already being forced to sit behind a screen all day anyways. Game addiction is increasingly being fingered for rising rates of college dropouts, and the World Health Organization has now classified game addiction as a mental health disorder. The shutdowns and social distancing brought on by the COVID pandemic have resulted in a gaming boom. With so many stuck at home with nothing to do, more people than ever are playing video games. It is therefore crucial we take a look at these issues before everything spirals out of control. Call of Duty, one of the most well-known and consistently successful games of the last 20 years, which is now the biggest it's ever been, can serve as a useful window for understanding what's going on and how we got here. Princeton attributes the phenomenon of game addiction to how advanced video game technology has become, i.e. video games are so good now that people simply can't control themselves. That the rejection of modern academic and labor systems is wholly irrational and has little to do with the quality of those systems themselves. But this assessment is wrong. The truth is, our growing infatuation with gaming is not a reflection of how great games have become, or of gamers' lack of self-control, but instead of how shit real life is today. Now I know what you're thinking. Dukedobbins, how can some guy like you who sits around in his underwear all day replaying Borderlands 2 for the 10th time be smarter than the World Health Organization? Well, I'll tell you, I'm not, but I read a book from someone who I'm pretty sure is. Because what Princeton and the WHO are just finding out, this author essentially predicted as far back as 2011. The book was called Reality is Broken by Dr. Jane McGonigal, a PhD who's regularly invited to speak at game devs conferences and forums. The book begins with a stark forecast that over the next generation, hundreds of millions will become immersed in virtual worlds, and that the resulting exodus of these people from the real world will cause major disruptions in the social and economic climate. When I first read this book in 2013, I thought McGonigal and the various psychologists whose work she draws from were being overdramatic. But since then I've come around, simply because such elite institutions as the WHO and Princeton have seemingly confirmed that this is exactly what's starting to happen. Now, where McGonigal and the WHO disagree is in their assessment of what's causing this and their prescription for how to fix it. The WHO, Princeton, and Prince Harry are ready to treat gaming the way we treat any other addictive behavior. Limit access, stigmatize the medium, shame users. If this strategy is as successful as it has been every other time it's been deployed, it'll accomplish exactly nothing, and may in fact only exacerbate the underlying problems. Whereas McGonigal essentially argues this is the inevitable result of human beings not having their psychological needs met in the 21st century, and that going forward, we have to design our real-life institutions, from academia to the workplace, to be more like video games. Otherwise, the world will only continue to come apart at the seams. The fact that McGonigal was studying this problem so long before many others were even aware of it by itself would suggest we ought to defer to her judgment over the WHO's. Unfortunately, while games media devoted significant coverage to the classification of gaming as an addiction, basically nobody has heard of Reality is Broken. Why? Well, for starters, it's a book, and people, least of all gamers, aren't interested in reading, okay? More tragically, despite the first third of the book being a mind-blowing capitalist critique that Marx would be proud of, the next two-thirds revolve entirely around augmented reality games, which, excluding the first 6 months of Pokemon Go, nobody gives a shit about. Thus, the book's message has been heard least by the people who need to hear it most: gamers. Today, speaking as an on-again, off-again video game addict, I wanted to give a first-hand account of game addiction and the circumstances which led me to it. and drawing from a wide range of other research up to and including the works of the frickin' Unabomber, expand on the central thesis being put forward by researchers like McGonigal, Edward Castronova, Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, and many others. That game addiction may simply be a symptom of a much more serious, widespread, and systemic problem plaguing us today. Is approaching the issue as WebMD suggests by limiting hours and keeping devices out of the bedroom really a solution? Or is it simply putting makeup on your smallpox and hoping they'll go away? Whether it's the growing epidemic of binge drinking, of opioid abuse, or skyrocketing rates of suicide, everyone my age today is finding some way to opt out. What if, at its worst, gaming is simply the healthiest mode of escapism available? And what if, at its best, gaming is in fact a solution to the emotional and economic dysfunction that literally everyone agrees is rotting our society at its core? What if video game addiction is good for you? The truth is, and I don't say this lightly, I think my addiction to Modern Warfare 2 may have saved my life. My struggle with game addiction began in high school. I've lost my mind 10 times over since then, but that was the first time, and it wasn't the game, it was that fucking school, man. It was 10th grade, 2010, and unbeknownst to me, ADHD was short-circuiting my brain. I hate talking about my attention deficit, because just like with my other lifelong struggle, asthma, it's the kind of thing nobody can see and everybody thinks they have. You have trouble paying attention in class? Trouble breathing when you exercise? So does everybody, you frickin' drama queen. So the coaches will tell you you're lazy and the teachers that you don't apply yourself, and you learn to blame yourself for everything early on. Cause I didn't know I had ADHD back then or even what it was, I just figured I was an idiot. Class would begin and I'd try, man, I'd really try, but the teacher would say something. The 18th century agriculture, which reminds me of farming and Harvest Moon, which reminds me of farming and Rise of Nations, which eventually leads me to RuneScape and the fact that I found out last night my RuneScape girlfriend who I bought an 80k Ring of Wealth for was actually my big cousin scamming me again. Fuck! Then boom, class is over. I missed everything, again. I just never could stay present, my train of thought an uncontrollable locomotive that long ago went off the tracks but for some reason won't slow down. I remember breaking down in tears once after math class after yet another failed attempt to pay attention and having no fucking clue why I couldn't. The difference between a punishment like detention or Saturday school and regular class is that in class they provide subject material that keeps you, if not entertained, at least engaged, occupied. But if you're physically incapable of paying attention, suddenly the 6 hours of class becomes indistinguishable from 6 hours of Saturday school, 6 hours of punishment every day, 5 days a week for years. Recent studies have found that the wandering mind is an unhappy mind, that isolated within ourselves we tend to dwell on dark and darker things, and that there's a direct correlation between time spent mentally unpreoccupied and unhappiness. Well, I learned that lesson the hard way. Sitting there every day completely checked out and not even bothering to try after a certain point, just sitting there and sitting there and sitting there thinking alone with my thoughts. Not allowed to talk to the kids next to me. Obviously you can't read or play on your phone, you just have to sit there, slowly dying inside. I was profoundly sad, and even now it's difficult to convey how shit it was, because I know ADHD just sounds silly, but I'm telling you it was the pits, man. Worse still was the fear. The unrelenting stress, unable to pay attention. I never had any idea what was going on with any given assignment or test, which made passing classes difficult. I was overwhelmed with anxiety that I might fail a class and have to repeat it, that I might get held back, that I might not even graduate. The humiliation that would accompany such a thing, the trouble I would get in at home, the possibility that I might be a fuck up forever. So I worked the streets. Flirting with girls I didn't like so they'd let me copy, stringing along exes so they'd do my homework, and oh, the bribes. I had $20 a week for lunch money, and I'd spend it all on slices of pizza, cookies, and Coke, dishing it out to the so-called cold lunch kids, who greedily fetishized the junk food sold at school because their parents only ever packed them bananas and shitty ham sandwiches. And when the money ran out, I'd spend entire lunches harassing kids as they ate for anything they could live without, sometimes irritating them to the point they'd toss me a chocolate milk just to be rid of me, and then I'd pass that shit along to whoever's homework I needed to copy. Not that things always worked out, plenty of brats took the cookie and then pussied out when it came time to let me cheat on a test. Other times I'd get screwed because they'd be absent the day I needed them most. As I flailed helplessly in math class, I complimented the teacher every day, told shitty jokes, asked if I could help out, introduced him to my mom as my favorite teacher. Once he had me read a word problem out loud in class, and despite being a proficient reader, I read as slowly and haltingly as I could, stammering and deliberately mispronouncing words, hoping that I could convince him that I was half retarded, not caring that the rest of the class would think so too, hoping to win his sympathy as well as his affection. Eventually I had fallen behind far enough that he stuck me in 3 weeks of lunch tutoring, and I wanted to kick his fucking teeth in, but I just grinned and went. End of the semester comes, and I'm convinced it was all for nothing because I had a D and failed the final, but Mr. Jones calls all the kids up one at a time to go over their final grade, and when my turn comes I have a D-, which doesn't make any sense to me at all, but he looks at me with a smile, a knowing wink, shakes my hand and says, "Christian, it was a pleasure having you in class this year." My eyes well up and I ask to go to the bathroom where I cry for a good 10 minutes. Tears of relief, but tears of helplessness also. Because after Christmas break, things are gonna get harder and I am only barely scraping by. And the 2 years left after that, can I really keep this up? These days of emptiness in which I look forward to nothing, feel nothing, enjoy nothing, trapped in a state of exhaustion and stress that never ends, in which there is no end in sight. Every day, the 6 hours of just sitting there, pushing my sanity to the very limits of its endurance, that pit in my stomach on the way to school, knowing how mind-numbingly painful it was going to be, and in the end, only ever having to show for it grades that would let me move on, but that still got me in trouble at home. All of this compounded by the loneliness. Feeling as if nobody could really empathize with my present situation. Generally ashamed of who I was and not wanting to give anyone too detailed a look into my life. Feeling, as so many kids do at that age, like I didn't fit in. Often in conversation, I would feel like I had nothing interesting to say. Worse, I felt like nobody else did either. My inner monologue comprising the bulk of my conversation from day to day, and if I had fit in, would it have even changed much? 6 classes worth of homework every night, those fucking sociopaths assigning it even on weekends. Nobody had time for friendship, man, not the real kind anyways. And so life outside of school was its own dull slog. The ultimate humiliation was even when I had free time, I wasn't sure what to do with it. Lacking friends, Xbox Live or cable, I found that my cage followed me home, where I would pace restlessly in my room and stare at walls. This was when I hit that stage of my life, which I always remember as the dark place. I became infatuated with sleep. I started taking naps when I'd get home, not because I was tired, but because I did not want to be awake. I would sleep as often as I could, feeling there was nothing better to do. And in the mornings when I woke up, my first thought was, damn it, I've woken up. I wish I could go back to sleep. In sleep, there was peace, relief, and in those first minutes after waking, I would feel the chaos rushing back in, the dread, the stress, the hopelessness. I began thinking of ways I might sleep longer, and more often. If only, I thought, I could sleep forever. But then, everything changed. That winter break, my mom finally caved and I got Xbox Live. I'd spent my whole life gaming, but RuneScape was getting old, and Super Mario Bros., Fallout, Borderlands, AI opponents who could always be mastered with enough trial and error, victories I would celebrate by myself in silence. Nothing is comparable to that first competitive high of FPS multiplayer, when you fight an enemy that is real, that grows and adapts with you, that feels things, that feels you as you sink the knife in. I didn't really know what I was looking for, I wasn't sure what was waiting at the end of this, but every fiber of my being craved it, and I dived into it completely, as if it were my life's calling, as if the fate of the world depended on my body count, which would break 150,000 before the year was up. The urge to compete is deeply embedded in human nature. The scientists now know this is because early man used competition as a means to establish hierarchy, that we evolved past simple brawls between alphas into more specialized contests that would establish which tribe member was the best builder, digger, climber, and so on to this day when we use elections to determine our best policymakers and capitalism to find out who's the best at everything else. When the founding fathers spoke of a government wherein ambition counteracts ambition, when we designed an economic system predicated on free market rivalry, it's because we knew that man's desire to pit themselves against one another could not be denied. It's because we knew also that such contests push people to their maximum potential. It is the fundamental building block of our entire society, our entire civilization in fact, and yet it's never discussed in much the same way as other needs like hunger or sex, because it is so ingrained in us that it might as well be as taken for granted as breathing. Sports, reality television shows, hot dog eating tournaments, and when we can't get involved in that stuff, what do? Pissing contests about who's got the best looking clothes, or car, or house, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, platforms not for sharing, but for flexing, for proving that you have more, that you know more than someone else. All of us always looking for some way to prove our worth by besting others, to win the admiration of our peers by being better than they are. This is the stuff of life. This is what it means to be human, in all its splendor, in all its catastrophe. The crucible of online multiplayer awoke something in me that I'd forgotten was there. It was able to break through my ADHD, pry me away from my darkest thoughts, and bring me into the moment, in ways in which schooling had failed to so miserably for so long. And is it any wonder? There's a reason most video games give you the option to skip the tutorial, because tutorials fucking suck and everybody knows it. And what is school if not an 18-year-long tutorial in which the only competition is you against the system? Other students aren't on your team or even your opponents, their presence is simply irrelevant. A tutorial, in which punishment for failure is that the tutorial lasts longer, and if you succeed, the tutorial continues for another 4 to 6 years, and when the tutorial is done, we wake up feeling just a tad empty inside, because after all that struggle and effort, we haven't actually had the chance to accomplish anything real. We've only completed tasks that were designed to be completed, that have been completed by plenty of others before, in which there is no material benefit to yourself or others, and worse, hardly any way to distinguish yourself from others, no way to explore yourself and what makes you you, no way to earn others' respect, no way to win self-respect. Meaningless worksheets and meaningless projects that get thrown out at the end of the semester and matter to nobody, not even you. There were sports, of course, but of the 365 days in a year, only 10 featured football games, another dozen or so track meets, and beholden as they were to a culture of participation trophies, nobody cared. Millions of teenagers across the globe flocked to that game for the same reason I did, because in it we found ourselves. In the furious combat with one another, we rediscovered our humanity. The classroom had become an enforced harmony, its participants isolated, untested, and bored. The game was its direct antithesis. 2 teams of 6 seeking to destroy one another across military bases, airports, radiated fields in Afghanistan. Every guy, every night. Dark, quiet suburbs with a faint white hue of screens glowing through everybody's window curtains. It's 3:30 a.m. on a Tuesday. The squad is up and the game is on. Tommy Watson, aka Twatson, aka T-Watt, aka Timbo Peep. He's a mild-mannered guy, a school band geek. He's got a massive hard-on for the AC-130 and raining death from above while he screams "get fucked" in the mic. I hadn't known him well before. For years, he's just another name during roll call, another face in the hallway, but online he's the friend of a friend, and it only takes a single match for us to know there's a mutual understanding, a deeper harmony between us that's worth exploring. Tommy. That rare breed of American teenager who wasn't consumed with his own ego, which fits so nicely with a guy like me who really fucking was. Tommy, who somehow could always see what an egomaniacal, manipulative prick I really was, who openly mocked me for it but loved me anyways. The Watson to my Sherlock, the Lucius Fox to my Batman. A man who simply enjoyed victory for victory's sake and was willing to run UAVs and play practically as my Secret Service while I hunted the highest kill streaks in the game. The Native Americans would send their 13-year-olds out into the woods without food or water for 3 days on a vision quest as a coming-of-age ritual. I like to think we did something similar on MW2, except in our underwear and with Dorito-crusted fingertips. The sun's first bright rays would seep in through the window, the kind of early dawn light that makes you say, whoops, maybe we've taken this a little bit too far. Tommy and I are the last 2 awake. We've been playing since we got home from school the day before. I'm running on nothing but adrenaline, Coca-Cola, and white cheddar popcorn. It's been at least a 15-hour binge with only 2 or 3 snack breaks in between, which we both know are really just jerk-off breaks, but this remains unspoken because it's important to maintain a level of decorum. And Cece stayed the night, and under different circumstances I might try to wake her for sex, but then I would have to deal with her, and I just want to play COD, so instead I jerk off with her snoring in the background, and when I'm done I come again watching some Wings of Redemption MW2 YouTube videos while I'm waiting for Tommy to finish snacking. Yeah, this is just like the Indians' vision quests. It's domination on subbase. We're getting off on our next loss. We said that 3 hours and 5 L's ago, but we mean it this time, damn it, or at least I can tell Tommy does, and that scares me because my KD drops every time I play alone, so I am more determined than ever to win. We're down 40 points and things aren't looking good. Teammates are taking UMPs to 1v1s with Harriers. There's only one way we come out on top here. The tactical nuke. We shift our strategy. It's a Hail Mary, a 25 kill streak reward that massacres the entire enemy team and ends the match in the survivor's favor. I've only pulled it off once before. I camp the rooftops between B and C deep in enemy territory. I set dual claymores at each ladder and roast some clown with my RPD to get the enemy's attention. It works. Like clockwork, they're coming up the ladders for payback, only to be met with the satisfying click boom of the claymores that I then reset with scavenger to let the process repeat. Grenades come streaming up now, but it's an open rooftop and they're easy to dodge. Tommy is taking down UAVs with Stinger missiles and watching the courtyard at our backside while I yell at him to do more, do it better, do it faster. A dynamic that will repeat itself for years to come, from the back of Warthogs or the gunner seat of AHZ Vipers, always petulantly pushing him to provide more dopamine for Papa Dobbins, he doing his best to oblige, with sweat pouring from his brow and veins bulging in his neck. We rack up hundreds of thousands of kills like this in the years that follow. In-game quests turn to real-world quests on YouTube where he edits my videos, and we do that shit for years too. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of 13 to 35-year-old males hopped up on the fruits of our labor. All of that the result of a partnership, a path we both in our hearts committed to on this day, this match, in this moment. Our plan is working. I've worked through the Harrier and Chopper Gunner kill streak awards. I'm 4 short of 25, but they're pissed off now, in the way any player is after getting pulverized 2 or 3 times in a row by Chopper Gunner rounds, and the smarter ones probably realize what we're up to. The sneaky loophole win we may just get, revenge, indignancy, fear. All these things drive bad guys up the ramparts faster than they can be managed, and my RPD is running low. Somehow one guy sneaks up on us, a claymore must have been taken out without us realizing. He puts the barrel of a Barrett 50 cal to the back of an unsuspecting Tommy's head and pulls the trigger. Pinned down behind an AC vent, I hear the shot and look over. Tommy's dead, and his killer is dragging their balls across his corpse while they empty extra lead into his face, meaning they're pissed. They must think Tommy's me and they don't realize there were 2 of us up here. I bounce the fucker with less of my RPD and jump to the scaffolding below where I retreat to a stairwell. 3 more kills now. I bust out an AA-12 shotgun. With my RPD empty, it's all I have left. Its effective range is about 2 meters. It limits my options. One way or another, this ends in the stairwell. And in that moment, you feel so fucking alive. You can feel every muscle and sinew stretch taut from your chest to your fingertips. Your ears sift through the gunfire explosions and ticking game clock to detect even the faintest hint of an enemy footstep. Your eyes darting rapidly between minimap and the front door and the back door, and you're running every calculation in your head, mapping out every potentiality and fork in the road. Will Tommy respawn and get back in time to help me? How many bad guys know I'm here? How many are pissed off enough to keep hunting me? How can I best defend this metal closet I've been backed into? From this corner, from the top of the stairs, you're judging lines of sight and potential grenade trajectories. Shit, man, should I just make a run for it? You lose touch completely with the world outside the game, with time itself, every part of you activated, living completely in the moment. This state of mind has been widely documented before. Most often we call it being in the zone. It's been studied extensively by psychologists. Preeminently among them, Shisai Mihemihai, who refers to it by its technical term, flow. Flow is a mental state that occurs when we are completely immersed in an activity. As Mihai puts it, when a person's body or mind is stretched to its limits in a voluntary effort to accomplish something difficult and worthwhile. When flowing, the prefrontal cortex in our brain, which controls self-reflective consciousness and memory, deactivates, returning us to our most primal state. The research has found that human beings are at their most productive and creative while in a state of flow. Indeed, many of the world's most successful billionaires, like Richard Branson, Elon Musk, and Jeff Bezos, regularly tout flow as instrumental in their success. The term flow was originally coined because so many of the successful artists, athletes, and engineers Mihai interviewed reported an optimal state of performance in which work flows from them, seemingly without much effort. More importantly, the research shows people are at their happiest when in a state of flow, during which they feel the most productive, the most alive. As Mihai puts it, and I really want to emphasize this part, quote, "The experience is so enjoyable that people will continue to do it even at great cost, simply for the sheer sake of doing it." The chess master at his championship, the athlete at the Olympics, Musk at his desk, your boy trapped in a staircase with a shotgun. Their score is 179 now. There's maybe 90 seconds left to pull this off. I unload a mag of AA-12 into the ceiling. This will put me on the enemy's minimap. One moron falls for it and rushes in, guns blazing. I paint the walls with his brains using a fire hose of shotgun shells that is the AA-12. To this day, the most satisfying gun I've ever used in an FPS, but to keep it balanced, or at least as balanced as anything could reasonably be back in MW2, they've severely limited its starting ammo. Something I've forgotten in the heat of the moment, thus I make a critical error by not picking up the deceased's weapon when I have the chance. A flashbang comes in through the door then. The screen goes white. Blind and deaf, helpless as an infant, I'm ready to scream at what an unfair demise this is. What a goddamn worthless piece of fucking shit game this is. But in a last-ditch effort, I blind fire in the direction of where I remember the doorway to be. Not a stab in the dark, but a spray in the white. In the blank void, a +100 appears. He's walked into the gunfire like a fucking dummy, but I am the dumber fucking dummy because in panic desperation I've emptied the entire mag. I only need one more kill, but my shoddy is out now too. The gun from that earlier kill is despawned. The most recent kill lies just outside the doorway. Can I loot that corpse? I poke my foot out to try and the screen flinches and flashes red. I'm hit. By what? From where? I don't know, but I'm pinned down and all I have left is my knife. Bleeding, in desperation, I hug the wall aside the doorway. It'll come down to hand-to-hand combat then. I know I'm dead, but can I stab one before they gun me down? Probably not. Already I'm bracing for failure, kicking myself for everything I should have done differently in the last 15 minutes. I explain the situation to Tommy and tell him I'm sorry. Red dots surround my position on the minimap. They're coming. More flashbangs. Blinded again, I stab wildly in every direction, even as I know it's over. But then, Tommy's voice over the mic. "Hang in there, Mr. Fag, I've got a plan." He's doing his goof voice that he only does in the proximity of something epic or funny or both. Since his death, he has respawned and sprinted across the map. When my vision clears, it's not the enemy I'm face to face with, but Timbo. He's dropped whoever it was outside that flashed me. Maybe he could cover me while I risk a venture outside for a fresh weapon, but he's got a better idea. He's cooking a frag. "Take my ACR," he bellows, and the nade goes off in his hands. His body falls limply to the ground. I burst out in laughter. So does he. He has killed himself to give me his gun. The absurdity of the situation is just too much. His sacrifice having all the solemnity of a Hollywood movie, but his death being necessary only because the game has no mechanic with which you can simply hand someone your weapon. My eyes are watering as I loot the ACR. Now I might as well be John Wick. Footsteps outside the stairwell coming fast. Inspired, I climb the staircase and balance atop the railing. As they enter the door below, I drop from the ceiling, screaming "Yippee-ki-yay, motherfucker!" as I hit the ground and drop shots spraying the whole time. Two clowns hit the ground at the same time I do. Difference is, I'm prone, they're dead. Third guy comes in with a striker and lights the whole room up like it's a Quentin Tarantino movie. I'm finally KIA, but fuck it, doesn't matter. He's too late. I got my 25th kill about 0.25 seconds ago. I got it, I scream over the mic, still laughing. Their score is 195 now. I call it in. The satisfying countdown clock, the in-game announcer screams, "Tactical nuke incoming!" Most of the enemy team leave the match immediately, a cheap tactic to deny me extra kills, but I'm so pumped full of adrenaline and every other naturally produced chemical in the brain that I could give a shit. Psychologists have observed that flow often produces an offspring, Fiero. If flow is the gradual rhythmic pleasure of sex, Fiero is the explosive fucking orgasm you get at the end. Fiero is the Italian word for pride. It's been used by psychologists and game developers to designate the intense emotional high we get when we triumph over adversity. Indeed, they've concluded it's one of the most powerful neurochemical highs we can experience, drawing from the mesocortical limbic center of our brains, which is most typically associated with reward and addiction. In her book, Reality, Professor McGonagall makes the point that not only do we all know the feeling, but we can all see it as well, because it's always expressed the same way. People throw their hands up over their head and yell. Because of its universality, neuroscientists are confident it developed early on in human evolution as a part of our, quote, caveman wiring, and speculate it's what first incentivized us to leave the cave and conquer the world. As McGonagall describes it, it's a craving for challenges to overcome, battles we can win, and dangers we can vanquish. There is a primal urge to pursue these moments of Fiero, to conquer and accomplish as much as we possibly can. As imaginary as it all was, in these virtual battlefields, our minds found the challenges they craved. To push ourselves to new limits, new boundaries, and maximize our potential. To discover one's abilities and see the growth of your ability measured. This is our programming. This is what it means to live. Measured in the rush of victory, the rush of kills and killstreaks and hate mail and pissed off, humiliated enemies. To accomplish things you weren't sure you were capable of. The glory to, in a single act, elevate yourself so far above who you were before. Elevate yourself above regular players to prove your talent, your significance, your worth. Those were the days, man, when you're young enough that video games and football teams and the season finale of Glee all still matter, and I mean really matter, like big fucking deal explosive emotional responses matter, before their smallness and triviality is made apparent as the cold hard realities of the size of the world and its fucking problems sets in. Childhood, adolescence, such innocent fresh times in our lives. So much primal wonder and pleasure to be had in the smallest and silliest of things, so much of that time wasted on the cold, hard, grey Soviet slog of the classroom. So we get the win, in a glorious episode we reminisce on to this day, and probably for the rest of our lives, as our nuke. The kind of shared experience that supercharges a bond between two human beings in a way sitting next to each other in math class or catching a drink after work never will. Needless to say, we did not go to bed that night. We play until later Tommy disconnects mid-match and mid-sentence, a sure sign that his mom has disconnected the internet and he's about to get chewed out. I don't care. High on success, I'm jonesing for a bagel and another jerk-off sesh anyways. Tommy's mom will force him to get to school on time. I cut class and let the world suck my dick while I fall asleep. To truly know someone requires so much more than simply understanding how they look and sound or their interests. A real relationship means knowing a person's fears, principles, goals, and ideas, their abilities and how they approach a problem, how they hold up under duress, how they handle winning, how they handle losing, what they take pride in, what they are embarrassed of, what bores them and what excites them, the types of people they get along with and the types they don't. It's about recognizing those mental processes, the habits, tics, and idiosyncrasies that truly define a person, which are invisible, which so often neither you or even they themselves can fully articulate and thus can only be understood through prolonged and concentrated observation. And even then, only in environments that inspire self-expression. When you truly know someone this way, you'll be able to predict with accuracy how they'll respond or behave in any given situation. Nah, if we do the care package glitch, Tommy won't play with us. At its most extreme, you'll be able to, as they say, complete each other's sentences. But in-game, I've noticed an even deeper synchrony that occurs between two players who fought together long enough. You begin to feel one another's decision-making process, to feel the other's movements without seeing them. It's this powerful bond in which you can feel incredibly close to someone in a given moment, without any words being spoken between you, without even being in the same room. What I think made school so lonely was that I never felt those kind of connections. Most interactions at school are very surface level. There's no shared struggle or accomplishment. It's every man for themselves. Other success or failure doesn't impact you. We don't work with each other, against each other. We're just working in the same room, doing the same tasks, silently at our desks. The tragic irony is that in real life, we had been reduced to the kinds of shallow avatars we typically associate with online profiles or Nintendo Mii people. Our self-expression mostly limited to our physical appearance. There is no depth to so many of our interactions and relationships, and how can we truly feel the affection of another human being when deep down inside we're perfectly aware they don't actually know us that well at all? But Tommy knew me. He knew I would try to push out people who weren't playing that well and refused to play unless I invited them to. He would know when I was trying to manipulate someone for my own benefit, like convincing them not to run high kill streaks because low ones were more helpful, but really just because I wanted all the airspace and kills to myself, and he would warn them what I was up to and not to give in. He would do these things and laugh at me and call me a fag while I did them, because he knew he had leverage. He knew I was dependent on his support play and craved his company. He knew I was too selfish to ever run UAVs or see UAVs, and that I would never touch an objective even if it was 5 feet in front of me. He knew I didn't even care if we won as long as I got a lot of kills. But he also knew that winning was way easier when you had a teammate raining chopper gunner rounds, and that with just a little help, boy could I make it fucking rain back then. So he would run UAVs for me and capture flags while I corner camped, and so I would get way more kills, and he would get way more wins than either of us could ever get alone. We had formed a Slayer-support symbiotic relationship in which our divergent priorities and playstyles could be fit together like puzzle pieces, establishing a mutually beneficial ecosystem of destruction. But more importantly, it was just about having someone who got you. The esteemed psychologist Carl Jung argued that loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate the things that seem important to you, or from holding certain views which others don't approve of. Tommy and I both understood, even if we couldn't fully articulate it back then, that MW2 was the most important thing in our lives. Hours-long conversations about game mechanics, best strategies, comparisons to other games, trying to understand why we liked it so much, trying to imagine if there was any way we could preserve this lifestyle forever. It was what we cared about most in our hearts, which we were too stubborn not to follow. This wasn't something you could admit to parents or teachers. It would upset them, as it inevitably did when they figured out the truth anyway. You couldn't boast about your in-game exploits at the dinner table. At best, you'd be met with confused, blank stares. At worst, you'd hear some shit like, "Now imagine if you applied this level of dedication to the classroom." Or, "Nuclear proliferation isn't something to joke about." And you couldn't always admit it to other kids either. Everyone played MW2, but only a select few were so driven by the thrill of our animal instincts that we played every night till our eyes blurred and we'd get off only to save our KDs. Back then there was still a lot of stigma around having no life. We weren't going to parties or concerts. Everyone agreed it was cool to be good at MW2, but it was still considered sad to play as much as we did, and if they did realize how much you played, they might use it to delegitimize your success. "Well, I could get double nukes too if I played that much," when in reality, they had it ass backwards. Nah, motherfucker, if you could play as well as I do, you would play as much as I do, because there's nothing better than poning noobs. Because of course, managing your reputation was half the struggle. Multiplayer video games are about ego. Because competitions are about ego. It's about winning respect and taking it from others. What made your in-game performance feel so consequential was knowing the very real effects it could have on your status among peers. It's why every video game always has an achievement or trophy system. It's why we have ranks, unlockable cosmetics, and stats. It's why in real life, we have badges, medals, ribbons, trophies, and award ceremonies. Because it's not just about accomplishing things. It's about making sure other people fucking know it. Respect is an invisible, abstract concept, and yet at the same time a vital commodity that every human being instinctively craves. It is the most powerful force shaping all human behavior, past and present. Today, it's why we have to say please and thank you. It's why we have salutes, bows, and why we stand up when the president or queen enters the room. You'll see its immense power if you ever flip off a teacher or a parent. Road rage incidents over the same finger, brawls in the Middle East if you show someone the bottom of your shoes. The power of respect is apparent throughout history, when even our most enlightened founding fathers died in gun duels brought about by unflattering remarks in newspapers, an all too common practice back then, though not as common as the samurai who would practice ritual suicide to save face after doing something dishonorable. Respect is the ultimate currency, one that we pursue, defend, and are often prepared to die for. Over the last 30 years, researchers have tried to better understand this dynamic. They've generally concluded that respect itself is a biological mechanism evolved to regulate our group behavior. Like so many other animals, we were a very social species in the beginning. We survived in groups, and group harmony was key to that survival. It makes sense then that we would be intrinsically programmed to prioritize our value to the group, what researchers call a need to belong. This incentivizes us towards behavior that benefits our group and solidifies our place within it, and disincentivizes us from behavior counter to the group's well-being, which might see us abandoned to die alone in the wilderness. In this, respect is a kind of social currency, with which our actions are rewarded or penalized based on their value to the group, or perhaps more vexingly sometimes, what the group perceives as valuable, even if oftentimes they are mistaken. Indeed, the research has found significant impacts on our mental and physical health, depending on whether or not we feel respected by our peers. Because on a primal level, it used to be where all authority was derived from. It used to be a matter of life and death. As researchers observe, even to this day, status equates directly to influence, opportunity, and power. The more respected you are, the more highly regarded your opinions and ideas are. The more trusted you are, the less likely to be mistreated you are. The more secure your foothold in the group is. The more potent your sense of belonging. Respect, the biological foundation of every competition, is what determined your place in the hierarchy, who was in charge, and who got left behind. So it should come as no surprise that we crave it, and like every other human being throughout history, require tangible demonstrations of its existence and our attainment of it. Tragically, such things were wholly absent in the classroom. Because on what basis were you to respect, that is to value, or be valued by your peers in class? Report cards that came once every 6 months, grades in which people were honestly more likely to boast that they had passed with the minimal amount of effort than to boast of high scores themselves, when good grades were just as often looked down on because they were so often associated with being dull or obedient and staying in on the weekends like a douche. And recall that respect, as the research theorizes, is based on actions valuable to the group. And what value did good grades have to anyone but yourself? So we do sports, or maybe the arts, but the returns are limited. The basketball player doesn't give a shit if you're good at theater and vice versa, and I think we all figure out soon enough that we, the performers, are rarely there for the entertainment of the audience. Rather, the reverse is true, where the audience, that meager assortment of parents, friends, and faculty, is there for our benefit, to quote, show their support. The unspoken understanding being that those who show up probably wouldn't if they weren't close to someone in the performance. And who could blame them? High schoolers aren't very good at anything, especially compared to what you can see on TV. It's the definition of patronizing. To be treated in a way that is apparently kind, but which betrays a perception of inferiority of those they came to see. So the youth is left with tragically little in which to assess their own worth and that of others. Most often in those gruesome days of high school, we resorted to, you guessed it, money and sex. Who, based on their appearance, had the money? In a world where most of us hadn't figured out how divorced finances can be from talent in 21st century capitalism. And who did we most enjoy fantasizing about having sex with? Unsurprisingly, so ingrained does this culture become that the trends continue into adulthood, where so much respect and success is still based on those two arbitrary criteria. But praise be to the Lord! We had at least one outlet for our humanity that ran deeper than our appearance. We had hobbies. And in my time, the greatest hobby of all, video games. In MW2, the wild, wild west of COD before skill-based matchmaking, having strong players on your team was a huge advantage. It meant winning more, it meant higher KDs and more killstreaks, it meant more fun. People value their fun. If you are a respected player, people would want you on their team because it improved their experience. I remember there was something so special, so exciting, so addicting about feeling wanted. Feeling valued, feeling like other people out there recognized and gave a shit that you existed. To feel in demand. When you would log on and be immediately deluged with a series of invites and messages from people wanting to play. Otherwise getting texts and calls while you were out doing something else telling you to get the fuck on. That other human beings genuinely wanted you around. That they would notice and mourn your absence. But it became about more than just playing with other people, it was about playing for other people. As Stan Lee has said, entertainment is one of the most important things in people's lives. Without it, they might go off the deep end. There's a great deal of research to support this claim, so unsurprisingly, society places a significant value on its entertainment. And entertainers, whether in sports, music, or cinema, are probably the most widely celebrated people in America. These individuals who are so respected for having mastered skill sets, whether on the football field or the movie screen, that don't actually benefit anyone, other than by giving them something to spectate. Well, for 15-year-olds in 09, MW2 was bigger than sports, music, and cinema. That shit spread through the halls like coronavirus. It was declared the largest entertainment release of all time, across every medium. So is it any surprise that MW2 became such a spectacle also? Because everyone was so interested in that game, and playing it, and watching it, and discussing it at length through muted whispers in the back of class. Because the game itself was held in such high regard. So too were the champions who rose to the top of its ranks. When you personally engage in a craft or sport, you develop a much deeper appreciation for the pros at its highest levels. When you're watching golf or British Bake Off, you may not be especially moved by the performance if you've never tried those things for yourself. But once you do try to hit a 1.6-inch ball accurately for 200 meters or bake a chocolate souffle without it collapsing in on itself like a dying star, then, with that proper context, you'll be in awe of the things you see such professionals accomplish. So too was this true for COD, but what separated it from golf and cupcakes, even from basketball and football, was that it wasn't something a few or even many people were doing, it was something literally everyone was doing. And so your accomplishments on that game, your stats, your calling cards, emblems, and rank actually mattered. In a way you could feel, in the way people's eyes widened when you would show them your stats, in the way they'd throw their heads back cackling with laughter at your stories when friends of friends would approach wanting to hear those stories for themselves, and when they'd ask what's the trick or how do you do it when you'd meet someone for the first time and they'd somehow already heard about you. When even Cece, who attended the rival high school, would laugh that when she was talking about her boyfriend in class, someone had brought up they'd heard he was good at COD. Here at last was some respect. And not that watered-down respect we call civility that we are obliged to out of a sense of common decency, but which is really just more patronizing bullshit. Just because people aren't outright rude to you doesn't mean they want you around. and we can all sense that. It's the charity of social currency, and charity is commendable. But it's not something anybody enjoys having to rely on, and how frustrating it is to be forced to. Gaming became the crypto of social currency, and remains so to this day, in a society which offers so little opportunity to win the real thing. We used it in these virtual underworlds, where we still practice the old ways. But the local chatter was nothing, that shit went global fast. YouTube, Huppet, game battles, an explosion of Facebook and Twitter pages and community sites that covered MW2 exclusively. Capture cards started flying off the shelves all over the world. It was its own kind of gold rush, and everyone wanted a piece. Maybe their ambitions were lofty, to be rich and famous, as it was clear those first pioneering YouTubers were rapidly becoming. Syndicate, Hutch, Sceneiners, Alienated, Martin, all of them starting back on MW2, back when instead of streaming, there was just pre-recorded live commentaries. Or maybe your ambitions were more modest, and you just wanted the satisfaction of friends enjoying your quickscope montages and cross-map throwing knife clips. Whatever the case, these ambitions were realized, not in front of those mostly empty stands at track meets, but on millions of screens across the globe, beamed to those millions of kids who found the game so fun, and who wanted to get better at the game so they could have even more fun, and thus binge-watched online anyone who was really good at it, or who watched simply because spectating was its own kind of fun, just like watching sports, and so the stakes were made even higher, the effects were magnified, your ability, your accomplishments were even more impactful, measured now not just around school, but in this whole online world of millions of people. And suddenly there was the prospect that you could cash in on that social currency, like all the actors and sports stars and politicians you'd see on the TV, that you could be a somebody, that you could make money being a somebody. The game began to feel real in a way nothing else ever had before. My soul had been covered in shit. And MW2 was a fire hose. Now I'd fill those gloomy hours of class daydreaming about what I wanted to get up to in MW2 later, or I'd spend them writing down potential custom class loadouts in my notebook. And as the teachers would drone on about dumb shit nobody cares about, I began plotting my path forward on YouTube. With so much time, I would plot 50 years out into the future, when I ruled the world as a faceless voice on the internet and the greatest Call of Duty player of all time. Where before I had felt so alone at home after school, now I had my BFF Tommy and handfuls of friends from all around the world anxious for me to get on. I began to experience feelings that I had forgot even existed. Excitement, passion, community, ambition. And what a thrill it was to finally have something to look forward to at the end of the day, rushing home to play and no longer escaping to sleep, but procrastinating it late into the night so I could play just one more match and one more after that. And without realizing it, I was deep in the throes of video game addiction. Where before I fought for C's, now I accepted D's, committing to only the bare minimum of academic success so as to maximize my gameplay hours. I started cutting as much class as I could. I calculated exactly how many credits I needed, and realizing I could afford 2 F's, I stopped going to PE and Spanish altogether, and instead I'd sneak off campus to go hop on MW2, playing now in my grandmother's garage where I was living after having run away from home following that last vicious spat with my stepdad when my mom called the cops. The campus was patrolled by Biker Josh, an ex-army vet sporting a goatee, dark shades, and an earpiece while he lurked around on what must have been a $3,000 mountain bike. Fucking dude was metal, but not as metal as me, jumping the fence, sprinting down the street to grandma's house, screaming, "You'll never take me alive, you fascist pigs!" I loved ditching. That exhilaration when in between periods you'd casually walk in the wrong direction, that thrill and relief when you'd get a few blocks away and knew you were in the clear. Having that sun shine down on your face while the rest of the kids were rotting at their desks, the tension of teachers and other kids fucking with you melts away. Free to do whatever you want, stop by the bagel shop for a pizza bagel, enjoying that special tranquility on the city streets that's only possible in the middle of the day when everyone is stuck inside. Grandma either not realizing or simply not giving a fuck why I was home so early, baking me oatmeal chocolate chip cookies. But it wasn't just about escaping school, it was about shutting out anything else that might eat into my playtime. Calls and texts went unanswered indefinitely. I ignored invites to anything that wasn't gaming related, too lost in my own compulsion to notice my real-world relationships with friends and family alike were dying off like plants without water. A grim realization I would have to face years later when I woke up one day and realized I'd alienated everyone in my life that didn't play games. At one of the few parties I did go to, we were in the backyard when a plane flew overhead. I put my head down and sprinted to get inside, coming to a confused halt with my hand on the back door. Everyone was staring at me in bewilderment. With a straight face, I told them that in a past life I'd stormed the beaches of Normandy during World War II, and this was clearly a flashback or something. That seemed less ridiculous than the truth, which is that I thought the 787 in the sky was a fucking MW2 stealth bomber, and that the instinct to take cover at the sound of a jet engine was so ingrained in me I was having traumatic hallucinations. One day, my mom had picked me and my girlfriend up after school, and we were gonna drop her off at home first, but I insisted vehemently that she just come home with us that day. Why? Just because I didn't want to wait the extra 15 minutes it would take for me to get home to MW2. I quickly realized what a huge mistake this was when she then expected me to hang out with her and was pissed I was just ignoring her to play COD. We got in a huge fight about it. She would break up with me shortly after. Weeks later, lonely and horny, the enormity of the loss settling in, I would beg her to take me back and succeed, but not before she'd had a new boyfriend, and I always felt pissed she'd been with another guy. My personal hygiene, never great to begin with, deteriorated rapidly. I basically wouldn't shower unless Cece threatened to withhold sex until I did. I wouldn't bother with laundry at all, wearing the same athletic shorts to school for months on end. Once, during summer break, while completely out of attire, I sat and sweat in the same pair of gym shorts for 3 days with no underwear. I got a nasty case of jock itch. Thinking it would go away on its own, I let it fester. The infection spread, and dear God was it fun to itch. I shoved my finger between my sack and thigh and just rammed it back and forth for like 10 minutes in the shower once, getting high on the body's natural endorphin response. Well, the combination of friction and moisture rubbed all the skin off my finger. It was a bloody stump and I cried out in agony anytime I had to move it or touch something, but I had no choice. It was my trigger finger, and it's not like I was going to stop gaming. I, an intellectual, decided the best way to beat the jock itch was to shave the tangled pound of pubes on my groin, convinced that this would make things cleaner, less itchy, and less hot. What a terrible mistake. The razor blade spread the infection far and wide so that now my inner thighs looked as if someone had heated up a Bowie knife and branded me like a cow. My room became a cesspit petri dish of weeks-old coffee and food, mountains of bottles, wrappers, empty Dorito bags, pizza boxes, dried snot, semen stains, moldy dishes, dirty laundry, dank sweat, weed, and memes. Too preoccupied to make bathroom trips, I would piss out the window into the yard. Eventually getting found out because my grandma asked the gardener why her hydrangeas had gone from light blue to dark violet and was told it's caused by the acidity in piss, usually from a family dog, but not this time. Funny enough, she preferred the new color and went on to encourage the practice. When I couldn't get my high, I responded with anger. If it was because I was playing badly, I'd put holes in the wall and break my controllers. For years, every dime of Christmas and birthday money went to replacing controllers, headsets, and even the damn game itself once after I kicked my own Xbox in frustration, mutilating the disc inside. If it was because I was lagging, I would write 10-page essays on how the developers were conspiring against me. I would go on prolonged tirades against my enemies in the pre- and post-game lobbies, stringing together such nasty, long-winded sequences of curses and screaming so loudly that Tommy would just warn everyone in our party to take their mics off till it was over. Once the neighbors, overhearing all this, knocked on the door to ask if everything was okay. They thought they might need to call the cops, so I cussed them out too and told them to mind their own business and stop moving my fucking trash cans while they're at it. And then came the punishments. My mom hid my Xbox from me and threatened to call the cops if I tried to find it. She said I had to see a counselor before I could have it back. Oh, how I seethed with rage at my powerlessness and vowed to never let someone have this leverage over me again. But for the time being, I had to play along. The youth counselor was just another country fucking bumpkin. Charmed his socks off and got my Xbox back after one sesh and never had to go back. But the episode shook me and left me steeped in paranoia. For years, I would guard my Xbox jealously from my mother who might steal it or my girlfriend who still wanted to destroy it. Little did I know the school actually was meticulously keeping track of my absences. Every now and then I would get a detention slip for my chronic delinquency, but I just ignored those too. What were they going to do? Sue me? But it all caught up to me senior year. During her reign as California AG, Kamala Harris had begun her controversial policy of arresting the parents of truant students. My mom got a letter in the mail, and I was notified by the vice principal that should I miss even one more class, my poor mother would be thrown in the state penitentiary. Well, the thought of my poor mother being hauled off to the stockade was more than I could bear, so at last I relented and started going to school. But the damage was done. They had tracked every fucking cut since freshman year. For every detention slip I had ignored, they had given me a Saturday school, for a grand total of 16 fucking Saturday schools. And if I didn't complete them all, I wouldn't graduate. Well, I didn't give a shit at this point about graduating, but I also knew my poor mother would take a hatchet to my Xbox face and soul if I didn't. So I procrastinated till the very last 16 weeks of school, and then did all 16 in a row like a fucking jackass. I wish I had a funny story to tell about it, but I don't. It sucked ass, and I hated it. I had fought the system, and the system won. But even then, as the collateral damage of my life piled up around me, there was never any thought of giving up gaming. I was happier than I had been before. As frustrating and painful as much of this stuff was, it paled next to the fear I felt of going back to where I'd been. I was terrified. And each time I sat across from my mother, or a counselor, or a teacher, or a coach, or a vice principal, as they berated me to get it together, I thought, why? Why am I not allowed to choose to be happy? Why is it expected that I have to be that miserable just for you people? I was perfectly aware of the chaos this lifestyle was causing. I just felt the trade-off was worth it. And if I was causing other people headaches, well, fuck them. They get pissed when you don't obey, but it's not like they bust out the pom-poms for you if you fall back in line. I'd been so depressed for so long. And finally I was out of it. To anyone who had a problem with that, I only had the same refrain they'd given me every time I was upset about something. That's life. Deal with it. And so, it's critical we understand the context in which addictive behaviors enter our lives. When you look at the studies for any addictive substance or habit, it so often correlates to the user struggling with many of the same problems I, and so many others, wrestled with in high school and beyond. Boredom, stress, exhaustion, worthlessness, loneliness, and most often, hopelessness. A sense that not only are things bad now, but there appears to be no way in which they'll ever get better. And yes, maybe my ADHD made me an extreme case, but how many other people have their own mental health problems? One of the most striking things to me about ADHD is how much overlap there is between its symptoms and those of depression. Difficulty concentrating, irritability, impulse control, lethargy, and we know that rates of depression are increasing dramatically across the board, so it's not hard to imagine many others may be experiencing some version of what I've described here. Americans today feel lonelier than ever. There is an epidemic of burnout as people work harder than ever and still struggle to get by, all while feeling undervalued, underappreciated, and disrespected by their bosses in the government. Boredom is pervasive, and social mobility has stalled, convincing a majority of millennials they'll never be able to retire. And these statistics are all pre-pandemic. COVID has only made everything much, much worse. So is it really any surprise that we see a corresponding rise in addictive behavior, whether it's video games or opioids? In the years since that Princeton study in 2017, even as the pre-COVID economy improved by many traditional metrics, labor force participation rates continued to decline. And when I see economists or the WHO bagging on people for playing games, I just think, fuck you guys, man. They don't owe it to you to be unhappy, they don't owe it to anybody. Because that's what stands out most from that Princeton study, was that the kids opting out were happier than those who didn't. People are naturally inclined to pursue happiness. Indeed, the right to its pursuit is enshrined in our Constitution. Nobody, not one person, is obliged to give up that pursuit simply because toiling in misery has become the only socially acceptable norm for students in the working class. After graduation, I gave a traditional lifestyle one last shot. I thought maybe things will be better now that I'm legally an adult. Things will be different. I'll have more freedom or something. Worst case scenario, I'll do the shit for now to keep everyone else happy while I secretly pursue my YouTube agenda. So I signed on at the local community college and went to work as a secretary for my poor mother, who was actually a high-powered cutthroat civil litigation attorney. But if I had thought these occupations would deliver a different end result, I was quickly disabused of the notion. The days in the office slogged on in deathly quiet as if for a funeral procession. It was Saturday school all over again, staring at the clock and counting the minutes while the void closed in all around me. I took and placed calls, greeted visitors, wrote shit down, typed shit up, mailed shit, vacuumed, and took out the trash. It occurred to me I was essentially a tool of convenience, like an Alexa and a Roomba combined. Like so many other occupations these days, it wasn't labor that required skill or thought. It was just the trivial shit nobody else could be bothered to do. It was the shit robots could do, but right now humans are cheaper. It was degrading. I felt like an object, as if I'd been reduced to an appliance. And then came that goddamn printer. Have you seen that episode of The Office, where Pam works all day trying to get a new printer to work, only to feel so hollow inside when she finally succeeds that it prompts a midlife crisis? Well, I lived that episode, as I'm sure many others have. Difference is, she got the thing to work, whereas I, after 2 days of grueling manual reading and online research, could not. I'd been reduced to less than an appliance. I could not even save our office from extra trips to Kinko's. Turns out, I'm not the only one who feels this way. A wide array of academic study has shown that workers today increasingly feel unengaged, unfulfilled, and generally unhappy at work. Even those who have found success and good pay report ultimately feeling miserable and pointless in their day-to-day existence. The most widely cited example of these problems wasn't retail and fast food workers like you might expect, it was corporate lawyers. High-powered, high-paid, well-respected jobs at the nexus of commercial and government power. McGonigal, Csikszentmihalyi, and a growing cadre of neurologists and psychologists argue that workers' dissatisfaction is being driven by a lack of flow state and Fiero in modern work environments, experiences which they've concluded are essential to human happiness, because they represent the activation of key biological mechanisms, including our attention, motivation, emotion, and reward centers, which when left inactive for too long cause depression, which they define as a pessimistic sense of inadequacy and a despondent lack of activity. They point out these instincts weren't meant to inspire us to pursue leisure, they were meant to inspire our labor. As organisms, we've evolved to enjoy the things which perpetuate our species' survival: sex, eating, and work. As McGonagall points out, much of what we do in gaming is itself a form of labor. Grinding in MMOs, the meticulous construction in Minecraft or City Skylines. But for some reason, while we find this kind of labor enjoyable and addictive, we rarely find the same satisfaction in our real-world work. Csikszentmihalyi spent a considerable amount of time trying to understand this disconnect, and identified 3 key conditions necessary for activating the body's natural reward circuitry to produce the dopamine, serotonin, and endorphins necessary to achieve flow and Fiero. He concluded that our work must have clear goals, immediate feedback, and a level of difficulty roughly equal to our skill level. Clear goals because we need to genuinely believe that the energy and time we are using will reap some benefit in the end. Immediate feedback so that we know said goal is realistically attainable and we aren't wasting our time in its pursuit, and a difficulty commensurate to our skill level so that we are not wasting our potential on something too easy or otherwise wasting our effort on something we aren't able to do. It's easy to see how these 3 criteria are met in video games. When gaming, our goals and the steps necessary to reach them are always straightforward. Beat this level by reaching the end of it, win this multiplayer match by having the higher score, kill this dragon and bring its crystals back to Mr. Wizard. You know what you're trying to do and how to do it. Feedback is immediate and consistent. Your enemies fall over when you beat them. You get points, you reach new areas and unlock new environments as you progress. Usually your character rank increases, you get more unlockable customization. It's why every game has experience bars, a direct way to consistently measure every little bit of progress you're making. Think of hit markers in COD. This feature was introduced so that you could reasonably measure how many hits you were landing at a distance or through cover, but hit markers became like a drug. The sound, the look, so they started putting them in freaking campaign and zombies too. It's not like when you're spraying into a pile of 30 zombies at point blank range, you actually need to keep count of how many hits you're landing. It's just that we get off on that feedback. Think of the points that pop up on the screen when you get a kill. It's basically irrelevant information. You kill a flag carrier and get, 250 points. There's no real reason you need to see that number, except that it feels good to see it. It's about the feedback for feedback's sake. Think about when you're on fire in Overwatch. Who the fuck cares? You do. That's who. And of course, every game has difficulty settings to ensure you can find that sweet spot where your skills are stretched to just the point that it's not too easy or too hard. When I was young, I played Halo on normal, but nowadays that would be super boring, so I play on Legendary. Other badasses find that even Legendary is too boring, so they put skulls in, so you can constantly customize the difficulty to match your skill precisely. This is why competitive games like Overwatch, Rocket League, and Dota are so popular. Their ranking system means that your skills are always at the exact sweet spot. If you lose, the game gets just a bit easier the very next match. If you win, it gets just a tad harder. McGonagall used Tetris as the ultimate example because it never ends. You always hit flow state when it reaches that speed, which requires your max mental capability, and no matter how good you get, the game will just get harder, and the flow is always there, every single time you play. I think competitive ranking systems accomplish something similar. Overwatch is essentially a never-ending game of Tetris that we play against one another, constantly trying to reach a new high SR, and there's always a higher SR to obtain. Researchers found that the criteria for flow and Fiero are most consistently met when the subject's labor is self-directed. This is because only the laborer themselves knows what they truly consider a worthwhile goal, adequate progress, and where their skill level lies relative to the challenge. This is why, while I take immense, never-ending satisfaction in Overwatch, many others get nothing out of it and instead find their most intense moments of flow and Fiero in games like Minecraft, Siege, Rust, or CSGO, or any other number of very popular games that I've never really been able to get into. The wide range of diversity in our gaming reflects the immense diversity in our humanity, and it's important we are able to self-sort because there's nothing worse than playing a game you don't enjoy. Knowing all this, it's just as easy to see how the criteria for flow and Fiero are not met in public school and many workplaces. In school, our goals are not clear. We're working towards a diploma that we will receive years and years in the future while having only the vaguest, most general sense of how it will benefit us. The goal itself was established by others, and we go along not out of personal drive, but out of fear. Fear that without it we won't go to a good college or get a good job and we will be poor and everyone will think we suck. We do not feel that inner drive of making the most of our talents, making the world a better place, or earning some tangible reward. The feedback is rare and inconsistent. If your papers are returned at all, it's usually at the end of a semester at a giant heap. Often by the time we see the fruits of our labor, we have long since forgotten the labor itself, and because it remains so vague how these grades actually benefit our lives, their emotional impact is limited. Indeed, for those first 18 years, it doesn't even make a difference whether you get bad grades or good grades. As long as you don't fail outright, you'll move on to the next grade. The difficulty of academic assignments are almost never customized to suit a student's needs or abilities. The vast majority of public school work revolves around our ability to memorize information provided to us in class, and then we regurgitate it a few days later on a test. This act isn't actually that difficult. It doesn't stretch us to the limits of our mental capabilities or challenge us in the traditional sense. Rather, what makes all schoolwork hard is how fucking boring it is. We know we can do it. The question is, can we pay attention? Can we force ourselves to care enough about something we don't care about? Can we shut down our natural biological reward mechanisms long enough to get it done? Can we subjugate our humanity in order to proceed? Many people wonder why they struggle with procrastination. Well, procrastination is what happens when you've internally calculated the amount of time and effort that will go into something, compared that to what kind of reward you'll get in return, and your body says, fuck that. You can't do it because your body isn't being activated. The mental resources required are not being released. Your brain's like, I'm not wasting all your dopamine on this fucking bullshit. We need to go get laid, son. Now, in discussing flow and Fiero at work, we must first caveat by saying there is a great diversity in the kinds of jobs out there, and many people have successfully found careers that bring them both financial and internal satisfaction. Paleontologists, game developers, nurses, etc. Really, any job can accomplish this if the laborer themselves feels it suits their goals and abilities. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. Man, after moving to the city, I did some bartending work at this local stage theater. I flowed, baby. Busting out drinks as fast as you could before intermission was over, the looks of joy on customers' faces as they take that first slurp of Jack and Coke. Big-titted trans women leaving fat tips and throwing me a wink. Me going, I'm not sure how I feel about that. But I think I'd like to feel it a little bit more. But I don't have time to explore my sexuality with transsexuals. I gotta get the word out. Which is that for so many others, work is a prison for the mind that provides no intrinsic satisfaction or sense of purpose, and only serves to kill them slowly instead via the increased rates of cancer, diabetes, and heart problems associated with the chronic depression that work causes so many people. A recent Gallup survey concluded that of America's 100 million full-time workers, over half aren't engaged at work, feel no connection to their job, and tend to do the bare minimum. It's easy to understand why. In work, our goals are unclear. The Starbucks barista does not actually care if America gets its quad-shot caramel macchiatos with extra whipped cream, and it makes no difference in their life whether the company's stock goes up or down. Because the company's successes aren't usually shared with the employees are indifferent to the company's goals. Said employees' personal goals are often just as fickle, because so often they aren't paid enough to save for anything, so they cannot move closer to any goals outside of the workplace. Raises are given out as rarely as possible because the company knows it can always just replace you with someone willing to work for less. So instead, a worker may set goals within a firm's hierarchy to get promoted, but because there are only a tiny handful of such positions available relative to any company's overall workforce, i.e. one manager for a dozen employees, such opportunities are few and far between for most people. So there's no forward momentum. You can work for years without seeing any progress in your own life circumstances. Immediate feedback is inconsistent much for the same reasons as it is in class. Wages arrive weeks after the labor was performed. Thus, even if consciously the worker understands the two are linked, on a biological level, the chemical process has been interrupted. Worse, the pay often doesn't change relative to how hard you have worked. You're simply selling an hour of your time. Slow hours and rush hours see the same pay, so you are rationally incentivized to do the bare minimum. Worst of all, the difficulty of many working class jobs is far below what the average human being is capable of. Even at the age of 18, you're already capable of all kinds of incredible mental feats. Abstract thought, reasoning, imagination, etc. You're not going to be challenged by the typical retail, service, secretarial, and other white-collar desk jobs out there, and will be even less so after they become even easier once you've done them for a while. To the point that the worker spends their entire day on autopilot. Not dead, but not exactly alive either. Flow and Fiero are not consistently achievable in modern offices or classrooms. Randolph Ness, a researcher from the University of Michigan, has argued that the depression we feel in absence of these things is its own biological defense mechanism. It is nature's way of telling us to stop wasting our time on goals that are not worthwhile or simply unattainable. But at this point, I wasn't just depressed because school and work were dull, unfulfilling chores. I was worried they were holding me back. I had big plans. They were getting bigger every day. I wanted to leave my mark on the world. I wanted to solve every problem I heard about on the news. I wanted to experience and accomplish all that I could with my life before it all disappeared. I wanted to be the master of my own destiny. I wanted to see Rome and Tokyo. I wanted to live. And I just didn't see how I could do those things when I was spending so much time and effort on random bullshit that didn't actually move me closer to my goals. So I do 4 more years of college. Okay, I don't have any particular interest or talent in engineering or science, so I'll do a liberal arts degree, okay. And I don't want to be a poverty-stricken substitute teacher, so that leaves a law degree, okay. So that means 3 more years of law school for a total of 7 more years of schooling, and probably just a few $100,000 in student loan debt that'll follow me around for the rest of my life, and I'll occasionally break down in tears over it like my mom does, but that's okay, because I will have earned the opportunity to keep working in an office like the one I'm in now. For the rest of my life, I'll get to come into the office every morning and sit at my desk in the eerie silence and type things up and stare at the clock and eat cold food out of Tupperware and stare longingly out the window at beautiful sunlight that'll be gone by the time I get off. And then I can go home and enjoy 2 or 3 hours to myself watching Grey's Anatomy before I fall asleep and do it all over again. And I'll spend every Sunday with that same pit in my stomach dreading Monday. And of course, at first, I'll have a boss, whether it's my own mother or some other lawyer, and they'll essentially give me a bedtime and tell me when and how often I can go to the bathroom or eat, but that's okay. That's how it was when I was a little kid and I got through it. And if I work really, really hard, then maybe in my early 40s, I'll have enough experience and will have saved up enough money to start my own practice. And then finally, I alone will decide my bedtime, and I'll spend 350 days a year looking forward to that single 2-week vacation I can afford. The cost-benefit analysis wasn't adding up for me. I had spent so long chained to desks in barren rooms with arbitrary overlords telling me what to do, and I thought it was some kind of gauntlet you run because there's some reward at the end of the tunnel. I don't know what I was expecting. Freedom, joy, prosperity. At the very least, some relief, but there was nothing. I realized then that school wasn't some price you paid for a better life. It was just a warm-up for what your whole life was going to be. It's like when you think you've beat the final boss in a game, only to hear dramatic music come on, signaling a new, more difficult stage. Except this wasn't a campaign you could complete and be done with. It was wave defense, and the waves would just keep coming and coming until you finally die. This was it? All the struggle and pain had led me to this? I was confused. Surely there's something I'm not understanding here, right? Because everyone else was really sold that this was the way to go. They would describe this life with words like dream and success. Well, I had my own dreams. I already had 10,000 subs. What if I had 100,000? What if I had 1 million? The fucking clowns who had already made it, like T. Martin and Syndicate, were squandering it on infomercials for COD and vanity vlogs. When with 1 million subs, you could change the world. And get in the history books. You could rally people to or against causes. You could raise awareness about political corruption or the heroin kingpins in Afghanistan. I'd be free. I would make my own bedtime and take a shit whenever the urge struck me, and as long as I had a laptop, I could go wherever I wanted, whenever I wanted, and I could game. By God, if I could make money gaming, I could game forever, and every day I would wake up excited to live and play and fuck and eat and to do only those things. And in every game, I would explore a new world and experience all the writing, art, music, and challenges it had to offer. I could live out of hotel rooms, roaming the globe, making videos anytime I wasn't busy hiking Machu Picchu or fucking hookers in Amsterdam. But it would take work. There was much to do. I would have to play even more games than I was playing before. I had to get videos out for new games right as they released. I had to not only learn those games, but get really good at them so I had good footage and knew what I was talking about. It was exhausting. I beat games like Crysis 3 and Halo 4 on their hardest difficulties the night they came out, at midnight, and went to school or work or both the next day with no sleep, and I'd come home and I'd try to start writing a guide for the shit, but my brain would be fucking fried, and it slowed me down considerably, and it made the videos themselves so bad I've since deleted them in shame. Just beating games usually took at least 12 hours of gameplay, and I would rush through them so fast I'd barely remember any of it, and the one advantage I had that might let me stand out in what was becoming a very crowded field was my writing, so I had to get better. I was sneak reading Stephen King's On Writing advice book in between classes, and he said the key to getting better was to read a fuck ton. Okay, so now I'm reading a fuck ton, but there's so little time, and to keep a following online, you had to pump content out regularly. And I'd frantically write commentaries on my fucking work computer anytime there was a free moment, and I'd down 5-shot espressos to get through the day and then get home and do a 5-hour energy so I could work on YouTube. And it gave me a nosebleed that lasted for like 2 hours, and I wasn't sleeping and begging everyone for Adderall because I'm juggling geology papers and mock debates on aptitude testing, and the end result of all this was that the quality of everything I did in work, school, or YouTube was all shit. I realized then that the game was rigged. When the government settled on a 40-hour work week, it was because the research showed that was the max you could push someone before their productive capacity dropped off and their labor was no longer worth their wage. It was the maximum amount of value they could squeeze out of a human being. But think about what that means for the worker. That they will be too mentally exhausted to adequately perform any other task outside of their job. Consider that today, the average worker is not only more productive per hour, but thanks to technology is typically working more hours than ever, thanks to remote labor. And every person has on top of that the added personal labor of errands, housework, and God forbid, childcare. And then motherfuckers still gotta go to school full time if they want to move up in the world. Give me a break. The consequences of this? There's no escape. Once you're locked into the system, there's no oxygen to develop your own talents, interests, or abilities, to pursue your own goals or path in life. I couldn't possibly give my real dream the kind of concentrated effort it required to be realized and still do working class full time. There weren't enough hours in the day. There weren't enough cells in the brain. And miss me with all this baby boomer self-help bullshit. Apply yourself, believe in yourself, get motivated, work really hard, stop wasting time on leisure, sacrifice, pain is weakness leaving the body. It's all bullshit. Guess what, America? There is such a thing as science, motherfucker. And what does the science tell us? The science tells us that a human being could not possibly work full time and still somehow have the mental capacity left over for anything else, whether it's learning a new trade, a new skill, or even just picking up a new hobby for Christ's sakes. It defies all evidence-based reasoning to suggest otherwise. Well, next they'll tell you to save. Work really hard and don't waste any money on things you enjoy, and eventually you'll have enough money to start your own business or take a few years off from work. But this isn't realistic in today's economy either. 40% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck before the COVID crisis. 70% of Americans had less than $1,000 in saving. When the virus hit and everyone had to close shop, the government had to immediately start printing money to send out because they knew otherwise, within 1 month, tens of millions of Americans would lose their homes and be unable to eat. Now, is that because Americans today are more irresponsible or lazier than past generations? Or is it because wages haven't kept up with inflation and the consumer price index for decades, and consequently, despite working harder and longer than boomers ever did, millennials can't possibly afford most of what their grandparents could? It's easy to save up for college when boomers on average only had to pay $250 annually for a public university. While today, adjusted for inflation, millennials are paying $25,000 for that same university, a 3,700% increase. Meanwhile, studies show that millennials are earning $10,000 less a year than boomers did for the same amount of work. And it's not just that people are having to choose between work and their actual dreams, it's that they don't even get that choice in the first place. Obviously, the over 100 million people living paycheck to paycheck don't have any choice but to keep working. They'll be out on the streets otherwise. It's not just that working life has become an unfulfilling, all-consuming, unfairly compensated, depressing slog that constitutes the majority of your waking hours spent on Earth. It's that there's no escaping it ever until you die. You can't work your way out of it, you can't save your way out of it. It is a system of wage slavery, wherein people's survival is so dependent on immediate wages that they cannot possibly leave their employer, no matter how unfairly compensated or poorly treated they are. But all those smug boomers would have you believe otherwise. They worship the idea that every problem can be solved with sheer willpower. They'll tell you all about how back in their day they worked part-time and saved up enough to start their own burger joint and traveled fucking Europe. Never mind that in their time, you could support a family of 3, own a house and a car, working minimum wage at fucking McDonald's. This kind of unrealistic worldview is of course where that infamous "okay boomer" meme arose from. Boomers' misguided and arrogant perception that today's economy is anything like the much easier one they came up in. It's as if somebody beat Halo on the easiest difficulty, where to win all you have to do is walk forward, and later on, when the rest of us poor souls are stuck having to beat it on Legendary with a few skulls activated, they're sitting there smugly giving us unhelpful advice and scoffing at our inability to get through the mission the way they did. Well, I don't understand why kids these days can't get to level 2. Don't they know all you have to do is hold the joystick forward? They're just too sheltered these days to know how to move forward on the joystick. If only they had the drive and discipline to push that joystick forward. Meanwhile, we're sitting there getting bodied by jihadi grunts that don't even exist on the lower difficulties, aka streamers brainwashing us for donations. Ironically, it's the get-motivated people who are actually the laziest among us. They are desperate for a simple solution to a complex problem, telling everyone that it's all in their head, that it would be as simple as people choosing to be better, that if only people worked harder or saved more, everything would be solved. This spares them having to think about or address the systemic issues facing the country, from having to confront how difficult fixing the shit is going to be, and allows them to wash their hands of it and not stress about other less fortunate people's problems. It's a cop-out, equal parts sloth and ignorance. It's a lie that the haves tell the have-nots so that there will never be any serious attempt at reform for a more equitable society. But it was a lie I believed, and the consequence was anytime I was watching TV with Cece, going in the jacuzzi, hanging out with Josh, playing a game just for fun, I'm always thinking in the back of my head, this is a waste of time, you need to be more productive, get back to something that matters, you piece of shit. I always felt guilty about enjoying myself, telling myself that that wasn't allowed until I was successful. Never mind that all the available research tells us that relaxation, play, and free time are crucial to our mental health and productivity, that we'll break down and die early without them. We are conditioned to associate leisure with shame,
all while we ignore the elephant in the room, which is that the pursuit of happiness is not an option for the working class, and the trap was sprung when we were kids, when we had to devote well over 40 hours a week to class and homework, where we mastered only the increasingly useless talent of rote memorization, and were meanwhile robbed of any chance to develop ourselves in our own direction during that one crucial period of our lives when you're allotted the financial support of others. One shudders to think how many people out there never got to realize their full potential because they were too busy memorizing math equations they'll never use and doing homework that all the science has proved conclusively isn't actually having any effect on students other than to waste their time. The idea that we have to devote the entirety of the first 18 years of our lives to a government institution and to fulfill government mandated requirements for nothing in return, or otherwise the government will arrest our parents, just seems so inconsistent with the ideas of individual liberty that this nation was founded on. I just can't comprehend how it ever came to this. The American dream has become a sick nightmare. The end result of all this? In 2019, pre-COVID, even as GDP was up, unemployment was low, and stocks were high, we saw an epidemic of deaths of despair. Across the country, in greater numbers than ever before, people are fucking killing themselves, or otherwise succumbing to alcohol and opioid-induced early deaths. In assessing the causes, researchers point to isolation, stress, depression, income inequality, and lack of purpose. And so is it any surprise that more and more Americans are simply refusing to play this cruel game, when not only are they happier playing video games all day, but by every measurement, they're fucking healthier doing it too? Is it not preferable that people are opting out with Fortnite rather than with shotguns and needles? Am I wrong to wish that so many of my dead countrymen had just tried to find some way to play video games all day instead of trying to be a productive citizen for a country that doesn't give a fuck about them? But of course, the central problem is that for most people, that is simply not an option. Otherwise, you'd see an astronomically higher percentage of young men abandoning the labor market like the fucking sinking Titanic that it is. And that may yet still come to pass. Incredibly, McGonagall's research lines up starkly with past predictions about the inevitable failure of modern society, from thinkers like Karl Marx and Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber. Now don't get me wrong, there's certainly much to criticize about these two, but part of their endearing hold on the public's imagination and discourse is owed to the fact that they made some good points, which are worth examining here. In fact, one might argue there is great overlap between their work and very popular pieces of contemporary art, films like Fight Club or The Matrix, music from Rage Against the Machine or System of a Down. It's this idea that the system, the present combination of economic, political, social, psychological, and technological controls that make up our institutions, laws, and norms, is exploiting and hurting people in mass to the detriment of all humankind. And some of Marx's and Kaczynski's predictions feel eerily familiar today. In his notorious Unabomber's manifesto, using language strikingly similar to McGonagall's, Kaczynski argued that the Industrial Revolution has been a disaster for the human race by, and I quote, divorcing us from nature, eroding human freedom and dignity, making life unfulfilling, and causing widespread psychological suffering. He felt that modern work disrupted human beings from what he called the power process, a biological desire to, and I quote, set goals for ourselves that can, with a reasonable rate of success, be achieved through hard work. And that even if one's job may be considered difficult work, without a choice of what to do and how to do it, it won't produce a sense of personal achievement. And that most people must now spend their time engaged in useless pursuits, which he calls surrogate activities, wherein people strive toward artificial goals in order to compensate for the lack of psychological fulfillment and autonomy in their real lives. He predicted these surrogate activities wouldn't be enough, and that we would take them to extremes. Essentially, we've become like pets to the ruling class. We take our dogs out to play fetch because this keeps them happy and healthy. Why do dogs enjoy fetch? Because like us, they evolved to enjoy those things which perpetuate their species' survival, in this case, to chase and catch things. Fetch gives the dog an emotional and physical activation that it otherwise wouldn't get because its needs are provided for in domestication. Well, nowadays, humans have to play fetch too. Kaczynski argued this is why everyone loves watching sports so much. If you followed a team, you know the intense Fiero hits you get when they win. Entire communities form around these teams. We have like 4 24-hour TV channels along with another 20,000 radio shows and podcasts dedicated to analysis and strategy for teams that not one of those commentators or viewers actually has any control over. Motherfuckers spend more time watching pre- and post-game analysis than they do the game itself. Around the world, thousands of fans are arrested every year for sports brawls. They fight and go to jail for a team that doesn't even know they exist, that they have literally no stake in. The game is completely pointless. It has no effect on your life or any fan's life whatsoever, and it's barely a team at all because they'll cut any player, any coach, and even straight up ditch the local communities they supposedly care about so much the second it is even a little bit financially beneficial to do so. I'm a salty Niners fan, if you couldn't tell. Kaczynski argued that our passion for sports was misplaced, that it distracted us from how purposeless we felt, thus delaying a reckoning with our circumstances. He also thought we were way too passionate about stamp collecting. But of course, we know what the ultimate surrogate activity is. It's video games. our real work doesn't satisfy our internal needs, so we go home and basically do fake work to feel better. My cousin will run IT at a hospital all day, and to relax when he gets home, he harvests berries for 3 hours to feed his T-Rex on Ark. Now we have esports. It's fetch within fetch, it's meta-fetch, it's fetchception, and hey, if it works for the dogs, I guess it can work for us too, as long as you're willing to accept that they own you like a fucking animal. Who's holding your leash, bitch? But there are key differences between dog and man. The dog can be content with fetch indefinitely. A pat on the head from you being more than enough reward for its efforts, and lacking the capacity for abstract thought, it never realizes how ultimately pointless the game is. Unfortunately, humans, forever cursed by our own intelligence, do have to eventually face the meaninglessness of our fetch activities and feel a profound sense of emptiness, and worried that such energies ought to have been invested in the real world, will abstain from any gaming altogether for significant periods of time. Surrogate activities embodied Kaczynski's greatest fear, which was that instead of reforming the system to suit our needs, we would be reformed to fit the system's needs. Case in point, when droves of young men exit the labor force, and are happier doing so, instead of taking a critical look at the system they're rejecting, what do? We go into attack mode. They're addicts, they can't control themselves, they have a mental health disorder. The instinct is to reform the individual instead of the system. This is seen as necessary for 2 reasons. 1, the system itself cannot function without millions of workers doing exactly the kind of work that causes so much psychological suffering. Assembly, processing, packaging, stocking, maintenance, sanitation, accounting, litigation, banking, cashiers, etc. If the workers in these fields all pursued their own individual goals, if in general workers had the economic freedom to leave the jobs they hate, global supply chains would fall apart, the economy would crash, and many of our most basic needs would go unattended, which would suck because we no longer have any access to the natural world to provide for our own needs. And having known nothing but the present system our entire lives, would be completely incapable of taking care of ourselves even if we did. That is, we are all completely dependent on there being an underclass of working people getting fucked over. We spent so long building a system predicated on the assumption that there would always be an underclass of people to suffer for us, that it has now become like a heroin addiction. Any attempt to get clean would require the courage to go through severe and prolonged withdrawals, which if mismanaged, could result in very serious harm. On top of this, the ruling class is naturally hostile to changes that might threaten their own wealth and power, which any attempt at reform in workers' favor inevitably would. Studies from Princeton, Harvard, and the University of Sydney compared legislative policy outcomes with the contrasting preferences of voters and special interest groups, and concluded that in America, the average voter has, and I quote, little or no independent influence on policy at all, and that the best predictive indicator of legislative outcomes was special interest groups' position on it. So, if a conflict arises between the individual and the system isn't going to budge, thus the individual must be adjusted. Kaczynski argued that in past societies, regular people could only be pushed so far before they revolted and crashed the system, resulting in watershed moments like the violent French and Russian revolutions. But today, modern technologies make it possible to modify the working class so that they will stay comfortably numb, no matter how mistreated they are. If someone is chronically depressed, we give them antidepressants and cognitive behavioral therapy. When there's an epidemic of insomnia, we give them sleeping pills. Never mind that it could stop your heart or cause suicidal thoughts. It's important you don't stay up past your bedtime, bitch. If a kid is struggling in school, we give them Ritalin and send them to Sylvan Learning Centers. In effect, the Unabomber thought that video games, therapy, pills were all essentially means of modifying an individual's internal state, so he'll tolerate social conditions that he would otherwise find intolerable. And it's not that these things aren't developed with good intentions. When the individual is in conflict with a system they have no power to change, modifying the individual is understandably seen as the sensible thing to do. Ultimately, if the system is left unchecked, Kaczynski predicted that most human beings, in order to adapt, would have to go well beyond surrogate activities and pills and eventually give up their dignity, autonomy, and individuality in order to keep the system running. In this assertion, Kaczynski echoes the works of one last infamous thinker we must examine, who I would argue predicted gamers' exodus from the labor force 200 years ago. I am, of course, speaking of Karl Marx's theory of alienation. Now, I am not Comrade Bidops here to tell you that communism is the answer. Marx had a fuckload of ideas, arguments, and predictions, some of which have been refuted, some of which were refuted by Marx himself as he got older, and funny enough, Marx and the Unabomber would actually have been arch enemies because Marx's solution to man's struggle relied on technological advances and collectivism, the 2 central mechanisms that Kaczynski thought would destroy mankind. But there was one area where these two completely agreed and reached the same conclusion, which is that going to work and school all day is really unhealthy and it's making everyone very sad. But Marx expands on the problem in much greater detail than Kaczynski or McGonigal, and if Marx's take on the subject is to be believed, then our present situation is infinitely more horrifying than anyone even realizes. Marx argued that our labor is the most important form of self-expression available to us, that it plays a fundamental role in our concept of self and our relationship to the world. That work is what makes us human and allows us to flourish. That what we do is directly connected to who we are. But because industrial modes of production rob us of the ability to direct our own labor, we are robbed of the ability to be ourselves, which leaves us feeling isolated from our job, from society, and from our own fucking soul.
I know this sounds like some hippy-dippy shit, but just hear me out, okay? Firstly, the worker is alienated from the product of their labor because the bulk of the wealth generated by their labor is appropriated by their boss. And since the relation between productive labor and the wages is unmediated, and they do not get to own or do not care to own what they've made, the worker will never feel, and I quote, the psychological satisfaction of a job well done. Stop me if you've heard this before, because you did 5 minutes ago when I described Fiero. The worker is alienated from their own labor, to quote Marx directly, because his labor does not belong to his intrinsic nature, that in his work. Therefore, he does not affirm himself but denies himself, does not feel content but unhappy, does not develop freely his physical and mental energy, but mortifies his body and ruins his mind. The worker therefore only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. Its alien character emerges clearly in the fact that as soon as no physical or other compulsion exists, labor is shunned like the plague. Stop me if you've heard this before, because you did 5 minutes ago when I described lack of flow in the workplace. Oh my god. To better understand this, imagine you have a family that needs dinner, so you decide to bake them motherfuckers a pizza. There are 2 ways you can go about this. Option number 1, homemade, baby. You make the dough yourself, use a special secret recipe you came up with on your own with a special cheese blend and just the right amount of pesto and oregano. Or option number 2, bust out that Papa Murphy's that's been sitting in the freezer for 4 months, follow the instructions on the box, 30 minutes later, you have it out on the table. Now imagine that the family absolutely loves the pizza. They go, wow, how did you make this incredible fucking pizza, Shirley? It's the greatest pizza I've ever had. Well, if you get that reaction to your homemade pizza, you're gonna feel pretty good. You're gonna be excited they like it. You're gonna feel intense pride in your work because in praising the pizza, they're praising you. Your ideas and creativity, your product has established your value and allowed you to express your individuality. But if what you served them was the Papa Murphy's, you're not gonna feel a goddamn thing no matter how much they like it, cause you know anyone could do it. And once you tell them that it's Papa Murphy's, they'll fucking know anybody could do it too. So instead, even if the fam is going, thanks mom for making pizza, Shirley still feels underappreciated. She'll still feel that emptiness we've all known for so long we think it's normal. She'll grab her sad slice of Papa Murphy's and go watch TV on the couch. Essentially, Marx would argue that this is what the working class has been reduced to. That all of our labor falls into option number 2, because we do not serve our own products, we will never feel an intrinsic satisfaction in our work. If you're working as a Starbucks barista, someone else came up with the recipe for your drink, someone else harvested the ingredients and materials used to make those drinks, and someone else directed the character of your service, from how you greet customers to the order in which you clean shit up, to how long you work. A similar level of control is found at most working class jobs. It's the difference between building your own castle in Minecraft and helping some anonymous person online build theirs by chopping wood endlessly to supply them. Ultimately, this leaves us alienated from ourselves and from everybody else. To quote Marx directly, let us suppose that we have carried out production as human beings. Each of us would have, in 2 ways, affirmed himself and the other person. In my production, I would have objectified my individuality, its specific character, and therefore enjoyed not only an individual manifestation of my life during the activity, but also, when looking at the object, I would have the individual pleasure of knowing my personality to be objective, visible to the senses, and hence, a power beyond all doubt. In your use of my product, I would have the direct enjoyment of having satisfied a human need by my work, and of having thus created an object corresponding to the need of another man's essential nature. Our products would be so many mirrors in which we saw reflected our essential nature. Now, what does all this mumbo-jumbo actually mean? I want you to imagine for a second you walk into your bathroom, look in the mirror, and can't see your own reflection. Well, this might be the cause for some alarm. But worse, what if everywhere you went, nobody could see you? What if you were completely invisible and barely existed? Marx argues this is exactly what's happening, because guess what? That shit you see in the mirror is just a tiny part of who you actually are. In fact, with modern medical advances, we know we can actually go play Frankenstein, switch out your face, limbs, organs, and dick, and replace them with somebody else's, and you'll still be you. You'll still have the same memories, personality, and IQ. You'll still be hard-stuck plaid on Overwatch. Because the vast majority of who you actually are is on the inside. Your ideas, abilities, humor, and character are only visible to the senses by self-expression, and if those parts of you can't be expressed, do they even exist? It's like Schrodinger's consciousness, man. Nowadays, we usually only discuss self-expression in terms of visual or material means, how you dress, tattoos, how you decorate your apartment, your social media feed, etc. But none of these is adequate to express what Marx called your essential nature, the ultimate sum of who you are as a human being, your ideas, abilities, and character. When you are denied any opportunity for self-expression, you never get to figure out who you really are, and nobody else does either. So does this mean you walk around worried you might be a ghost? No. But what you might feel is a profound sense of emptiness. You might ask yourself, why am I even here? Why do I get up in the morning? What am I fighting for? What is the point to my existence? Why is life itself so meaningless? You might feel lonely. Even when you're surrounded by other people, you feel disconnected. You might feel like you don't actually matter to anybody, as if nobody really cares that you even exist.
You might feel frustrated because you can tell how other people see you based on how they treat you, and you disagree with how they see you, but you don't know how to change that perception. You can tell people think you're dumb when you know you're not. You can tell other people think you're lazy when you know you're not, but you have no way to prove them wrong. And because the only way you can see yourself is how other people see you, you might just end up believing them one day. This is what it means to be alienated. Today we know that a lack of self-expression leads to all kinds of mental health problems. Gamers know how much people want to express themselves. After all, what's the most profitable commodity in this industry? Not the games, not the equipment, but the skins. People are so desperate for even the most pathetic opportunity to express their identity that skins by themselves are a billion-dollar market. They rob us of our humanity and sell it back to us in tiny, overpriced pieces. Well, I couldn't have articulated any of this shit to you back then, but I knew something was wrong, and I wanted out. So I wrote. At first I thought the key to success was just having good gameplay and telling other people how to get good gameplay, but I learned quickly what really got views was interesting ideas, funny stories, explaining confusing shit, voicing others' angers. Coming up with new video topics meant understanding new concepts, spanning a range of different fields, learning about a whole bunch of shit I never otherwise would have been bothered to. To better understand lag, I wound up learning about binary, fiber optic, net codes, cables stretched across the ocean. I mean, who would have thought? To understand games pricing, microtransactions, subscription models, I wound up learning all about supply and demand, minimal viable products, fiduciary responsibilities, CPB and FCC regulations. To understand loot boxes, I learned all this mind-blowing shit about gambling addiction. To understand why some games were fun and others weren't, I learned all about the brain, dopamine, gray matter, neuroplasticity, the psychology behind anger and friendship. I would try to understand these things for the views, but inadvertently I found they helped contextualize some of my own confusion and difficulties in life, that my entire view of the world around me was evolving dramatically. I got good at writing. I would examine in detail the watch times and engagement levels on videos. I got really good at keeping people's attention for longer and longer durations. I learned to keep my sentences as short and crisp as possible. I would experiment with different kinds of writing to see what would generate the most discussion in the comments, to see what would make people the most angry. Sometimes I would try to make huge swaths of people as angry as I could just to see what I was capable of. I learned SEO and marketing and directing too, understanding the sounds and sights that needed to accompany points I was making to maximize understanding and emotional impact. When I first started YouTube, I thought I had the only skill I needed, that 2KD biatch, and when you go back to those early videos, you can see how bad I was at everything else. It was never my intention to develop new skills or learn new things. In fact, learning was like my least favorite activity, but it just kind of happened. And what's funny is my great-grandpa and my grandma were writers, and my dad is actually an Emmy-winning director. I never meant to follow in the footsteps of my ancestors, and yet I instinctively leaned more and more on what I now realize must have been my naturally inherited strengths, because I woke up one day and I was like, hey, what a funny fucking coincidence. As time went on, I found I was less and less interested in the money, and instead I was becoming obsessed with the comment section. At my peak, when Destiny first released, I had a couple months of like these 4K checks, which for a 21-year-old was a pretty big deal, but I'm telling you, that high was nothing compared to those times when you could tell a video had had some kind of impact. When they would talk about how a video made them feel better about their own shit, how it helped them understand their own shit, how it totally changed their life, how they're sending their kid to a new school and shit. When they talk about how emotional it made them or leave page-long comments describing those emotions, and not just the positive stuff but the mean stuff too. Sometimes a video would be provocative enough to get on Reddit and all the salty Redditors would talk shit, but I'd still obsessively read to the bottom of every thread getting high on the fact that people were talking about me at all. They'd make entire videos talking shit and I'd just be tickled pink that they knew I existed. At the time, I chalked this up to some kind of narcissism, but in retrospect, it feels obvious that I was going through some process like Marx described, trying to express all those parts of myself that had never had a chance to be seen before. My abilities as a writer and thinker, my opinions, huge chunks of my personality and sense of humor that could only be revealed when I was pursuing an actual goal, exploring interesting subjects and performing for an audience. Parts of myself that I was desperate to see in the mirror reflected back in the voluminous reactions of commenters across the internet. And just as we might use a real-world mirror to assess and adjust our physical appearance, so too does this kind of mirror allow us to understand and modify our inner selves, to discover, grow, practice, and ultimately master ourselves and maximize our value to one another. As for Tommy, what he learned editing with me he used to start making Fallout Machinima. Just for shits and giggles at first, but then he got noticed and picked up by Shoddycast, where he did Fallout Machinima professionally for a few years. Raked in the fucking dough, did work for millions of people, and even got to meet the voice actor behind 3 Dog. All the while, he was piloting in Battlefield 10 hours a day. He was even the #1 ranked pilot on BF1 for a while, under my name of course, to bring glory to the channel. He got so addicted to in-game air combat that he progressed to authentic flight simulators. He started studying real-world planes and history, and now he's working as a mechanic at the fucking airport, saving up to get his pilot's license. And I think he's guaranteed to do well in the air, because while he was editing for me, he turned into a fucking blimp. When we started gaming and YouTube, we didn't quite understand what we were searching for, but I realize now what we found was ourselves. We discovered our essential nature, or at least began that process. I'm not sure it ever ends. And even though our goals had been mostly selfish, money, freedom, fame, etc., we ended up discovering the ways in which we could make ourselves most useful to our fellow man, to contribute to human civilization by utilizing those talents most unique to us. In Western philosophy, since its origins from Aristotle to Ralph Waldo Emerson, it's been widely understood that the proper end of man is the realization of his character and potentialities as a human being, that our opportunity to be the best and most true versions of ourselves possible was the ultimate freedom. But that opportunity, that measure of freedom, is lost to us now, completely. Presently, hundreds of millions of Americans are being born into a system that they have no control over, which they have no choice but to participate in, and which oftentimes they cannot ever exit, regardless of how hard or long they work. All available research concludes this system inflicts severe damage on our physical and mental health, starting at the earliest of ages. It is a kind of gruesome prison for the mind, in which so many cannot be themselves, cannot explore themselves, cannot grow, cannot pursue their own interests. It is a system which requires the maximum availability of their time and energy, and in return provides only the bare minimum needed to survive. A clever catch-22, in which attempting to pursue needs beyond physical survival requires sacrificing the means by which said physical survival is made possible. To even make an attempt at self-actualizing is to risk poverty, hunger, and homelessness. The data makes clear that college degrees are increasingly ineffective at altering this trajectory. In many cases, the debt people take on for college actually makes the situation worse. Even then, the sheer cost and amount of labor that college requires makes it an unrealistic option for many Americans born below a certain income level. And even then, we know that many successful college graduates with successful careers are still afflicted by the same psychological ailments of purposelessness and depression that torment their peers below, because simply making more money does not solve the problem if it is not somehow accompanied by more freedom. And so, America, once again we arrive at a crossroads, in which every one of us is faced with two paths. In such times when the forces of tyranny aligned against us are so seemingly impregnable, it can be easy to choose the path of least resistance, to accept our meager station in life and make the best of it, to submit to a life we generally detest and justify it with pretty clothes, prettier cars, and whatever else we can buy, to compromise with our profound loneliness, abandon our truest selves, and console ourselves that at least poor people in Africa have it worse. To make peace with the devil's bargain, that the price of mankind's progress is to sacrifice all that which makes us human. Well, hear this, America. Fuck that shit. I opt instead for a second path. That path which our forefathers walked in the face of monarchism, fascism, and communism. We are a country founded by men who understood that a life without freedom is no life at all. I will not desecrate their graves with complacency. I will not let 2.5 centuries of toil and sacrifice go to waste, wasted on a society that has abandoned its liberty in any practical sense of the word. The intellectuals will not save us, or they would have by now. The scientists will not save us, or they would have by now. The businessmen will not save us, or they would have by now. The artists will not save us, or they would have by now. The priests will not save us, or they would have by now. In this dark hour, there is only one class of American whose shoulders we can rest our hopes on. One breed of patriot with the fight left in them and the training necessary to cast off these chains, deliver us from the jaws of aristocracy, and bring justice to the Republic. I speak, of course, of the American gamer. I know on its face this may sound absurd, but gamers are uniquely situated to fix the pickle we're in. For one, we know that gamers have the best minds. All available research to date has concluded gamers are better critical thinkers and creative problem solvers, that there's a direct correlation between time spent gaming and gray matter in the brain. Further, gamers, having spent so much time playing around with their own biological instincts and human nature, will have the clearest, most visceral understanding of where the incompatibilities are in the real world. But most importantly, there's nobody better than gamers at assessing structural deficiencies in a system and applying the pressure necessary to get the rules changed. Every video game is a micro-society. It has laws, norms, and parties with competing interests in how the game is designed. Gaming communities regularly engage in public pressure, backlash, and advocacy to mold the virtual worlds they inhabit to their liking. Every single one of you is already an expert in the skills necessary to effect change. The activist backlash to games like Star Wars Battlefront 2, Fallout 76, Evolve, Halo MCC, Battlefield 5, and so many others, where a game was either significantly reformed or entirely destroyed by gamers' disapproval, are perfect examples of the kind of big dick energy we need right now. I just need y'all to take some of that effort you've been using to reform Destiny Eververse markets and dedicate it to America instead. Our economy, our government, our laws are all imaginary, man-made systems. We should think of them exactly how we think of our video games. Instead of code on a computer, it's words on a paper. Like a video game, the goal is to maximize player satisfaction by providing incentive structures and rules that meet our needs and desires, balanced against the needs and desires of others. During my time on YouTube, I've tried to point out the inherent flaws in various games' design and suggest the best potential remedies. Many of you have subscribed to me for this reason. Well, I would like to now describe to you, in the greatest, most excruciating, minute possible detail, America the video game, and the updates this game desperately needs. First, we must understand what kind of video game America is, and I'm sure you all already know the answer. America is Call of Duty. Capitalism is a competition. When it works, it's a lot of fun, and it brings out the best in mankind through our age-old ritual of competition as nature intended. But as is so often the case with our favorite video games, it suffers from a game-breaking flaw, which is that the wealth return rate on capital exponentially outpaces the overall rate of growth in the economy, inevitably leading to massive inequality. This is what economists call R greater than G. R greater than G is the tiny piece of broken code that causes the whole game to crash. It is, I believe, the root of all human suffering in the 21st century. R greater than G was long theorized but most definitively established in Capital in the 21st Century by the French economist Thomas Piketty, who won the Nobel for his work. The book was controversial, as any book directly challenging the economic interests of the wealthy elite would be. But despite quibbles with methodology and proposed solutions, to date, nobody has been able to seriously refute Piketty's central claim that over the last 250 years, unchecked capitalism has resulted in massive wealth inequality that inevitably leads to hereditary oligarchies and ultimately some kind of system crash in the societies that practice it. So to describe R is greater than G more clearly, it essentially means citizens who make money by owning things make money faster and faster and faster until they are collectively accumulating wealth faster than the economy can generate it. You probably already understand that it's way easier to make money when you have money. So 50 years ago, Joe Schmo buys land and puts up an apartment complex. Now as a landlord, he can tap the bulk of his working class tenants' wages, which eventually allows him to buy up more property and tap the wages of even more working people, and so on. As more and more of the available land is bought up and heavily invested in, it appreciates, making it increasingly difficult, if not impossible, for any regular person to ever afford property and become a landlord themselves. And if new land ever does become available, Joe Schmo will always be in a better position to outbid someone trying to work their way up for the first time. His kids inherit his assets and continue the process. It's not just real estate, it's any economic mechanism that involves ownership. If a very wealthy person puts $1 million in a safe stock, a 3-point climb that year will mean a $30,000 profit, whereas a working person putting in $1,000 in that same stock will only get $30. As said wealthy investors pump more and more into those stocks, stock prices appreciate dramatically, making it that much harder for non-wealthy investors to afford a meaningful return. This is why the stock market was able to rise even while the economy crashed during COVID. It was just rich people placing bets on what they think will survive. And of course, through interest rates on cars, houses, student debt, credit cards, and whatever else, banks are able to eat up larger and larger chunks of everyone's paycheck. The list goes on and on of clever ways to make exponential profit through owning capital, oftentimes passively, that is, without actually having to contribute labor. To some extent, this is how it's supposed to work. It incentivizes good ideas and facilitates the efficient distribution of resources to people with good ideas. But the problem is, when the process is left unchecked for too long, the vast majority of available economic resources gradually concentrate at the top, leaving less opportunity for regular people to move up in the world. What you'll sometimes hear about in the news is a lack of social mobility. The economy as a whole can only generate a finite amount of wealth each year, so eventually the exponential nature of capital gains means all of that new economic growth each year is immediately absorbed by whoever has the most wealth already. Which means if your net worth is below a certain point, it stays there for good. But if your net worth is above a certain level, it grows and grows and grows faster and faster and faster. So on the news, when motherfuckers talk about the economy growing, remember, they're talking about their economy, not yours. Your economy is smaller than the generations that preceded you. That's why younger generations are having to work way harder while being able to afford way less than boomers. It can be difficult to convey the gravity of our current situation to many people. Fortunately, anyone who's ever played Call of Duty can very easily understand just how fucked this situation is. Imagine for a second you're in COD matchmaking. You join a match in progress. Dun dun dun. It's one of those matches, you know what I'm talking about. The kind where you instantly know why the person whose spot you're filling left. When the kill feed is scrolling faster than you can read it, announcing nothing but deaths from your team. You load in, and when you try to leave your spawn, it's immediately clear to you that the match is unwinnable, if not outright unplayable. You're spawn trapped, like it's COD 4 Black Ops 1 Demolition. The enemy team long ago seized every power position on the map, and they're just ADSing at every corner you might walk around. They have a permanent UAV in the air, they're taking turns calling in chopper gunners and AC-130s. Well, this is exactly what's happening to you in real life. The more money they have, the more they make, the more they have, the more they make. Just as in COD, the more kills they have, the more streak awards they get, meaning more kills, meaning more kill streaks. Just like in real life, there's often a very passive nature to the winning team's success. Once they have that first 5 kills for a predator missile or what have you, they find a safe corner in the back of the map, bust out the laptop and call in their streaks, and they can just kind of sit there building a Harrier off the predator and leveraging that into a chopper without ever actually having to move or do anything. And with increasing frequency in real life, it's like people inherit the predator missile from Pops, and they're good to go. They don't even have to do the initial labor of those first 5 kills. There is a wide variety of COD kill streaks. They can use choppers to mow you down, EMPs to keep you confused, UAVs to know where you are, and the same is true in real life. Outside of real estate stocks and debts, the wealthy elite can buy up media to push their public policy needs, they can bribe their kids into any college they want, they can bribe the college to teach everyone's kids any lesson they want, and they have absolute free reign over the judicial systems. Anytime they face legal trouble, they have the power to settle out of court, which means pay people not to get them in trouble, basically, and it works for all but the most serious offenses. With NDAs, they can pay you to never talk about it again. And if the bribe doesn't work, they'll just outspend you in court. Hire a better lawyer, hire 10 times as many lawyers, drag the court case out as long as they possibly can to the point where the other guy can't afford to pay his lawyer anymore, and win the case by running out the clock even when they're wrong on the merits. The most infamous example of this would be Peter Thiel bankrupting Gawker. And fine, nobody really cared about Gawker, but just keep in mind this exact same dynamic is playing out in courtrooms every day across America anytime a regular person has a legal dispute with a bank, corporation, or wealthy individual. Once a player is wealthy, there's a variety of powerful tools they can deploy across media, academia, and the courts to protect and enhance their wealth. It's a real-world spawn trap. So in COD, when we get stuck in a match like this, we basically have two options. Option number one, the optimist, the believer. XX Swagscopes 420XX, the guy who valiantly charges at a spawn again and again and again, who ends up going like 2-40 at the end of the match. Ironically, the guy who tries the hardest is the one who ends up benefiting the enemy team the most, by feeding them more and more free kills towards their streak rewards. Tragically, this is also the route most working people are forced to take. When we pursue the American dream in the traditional way we've all been raised to believe in, by taking on car and student loan debts, working hard 40 hours a week, moving out and getting in place of our own as soon as we're able, what ends up happening? Well, the vast majority of the wealth you generate is appropriated by people at the top. To turn a meaningful profit on you, your company has to pay you less than the total amount of wealth you generate each hour for the company. And what happens with most of the money you do get to keep? Well, it usually goes immediately to your landlord or otherwise to service your car, student, and housing debts, and various insurance payments, leaving you with just enough to get by so that you can keep funneling wealth to those motherfuckers, making them all the more powerful, and all the meanwhile, you're stuck. You can't afford to make any significant headway in life. You are being farmed, as if you were spawn trapped on high rise. Instead of farming your KD, they are farming most of every paycheck you get. And right now, somewhere between 100 to 200 million Americans are stuck in that position for life. And this is how we end up with 1% of the population controlling 90 to 90% of the wealth any given year. If America had a scoreboard, it would look exactly like the end of one of those COD matches, where one team is all 40-0 and 25-1, while the other team is all going 1-30. It's all so frighteningly similar, it almost makes me wonder if COD's success isn't somehow owed to how our brains have been conditioned by the system we came up in. But of course in Call of Duty, most people don't go with option number one. They go with option number two. And most of the time it's not even a rage quit. It's a sad quit. Recognizing the futility of the match and just giving up. They get tired of just sitting there to get beat up on and feed other players' stats. It's boring, it's depressing, it's humiliating, so they just quit the match. Now we have to ask what the real world equivalent of that would be. And it's not that the winning team is necessarily comprised of immoral players or cheaters. They're playing the game to the best of their ability as they are logically supposed to. The flaw is in the design. And they compete with each other too. Each player wants to be at the top of their team's scoreboard, but they are competing over who gets to farm you the most. You are not on that team. You are on the team being farmed. When you are spawn trapped in COD, it's depressing, it's boring, it hurts your stats, and it leaves you no freedom to go anywhere on the map or accomplish anything in the game. Being farmed sucks just as bad in real life for the same reasons. So long as the bottom 2/3 of America remain spawn trapped, they will be stuck in the kind of wage slavery that inflicts all this psychological damage and denies them their God-given freedoms. Now, Call of Duty has spent the last 10 years trying to fix this, with varying degrees of success. We've seen all different kinds of kill streak systems and support streaks and specialist streaks and point streaks, and I remember I always thought death streaks and care packages were COD's version of welfare checks. And nowadays, all of this is why you don't take a loss for matches that you've joined in progress. But I barely play COD anymore, so I don't give a shit. What I do care about is America. So how do we fix all this shit to make for a more balanced, fair, and enjoyable country? One that meets people's needs, guarantees freedom, and prevents our economy from devolving into an unplayable catastrophe that everyone wants to rage quit. For starters, any solution to our current problems has to begin with a fundamental change in how we view human nature. Presently, the general consensus is that human beings in our most natural state are lazy, selfish organisms, and that unless we are coerced into labor via threats of homelessness and hunger, we will simply lie around and do nothing for the rest of our lives. This is the argument the government relies on to justify its lack of support for the public, and to justify kids being forced into such highly regimented educational systems from birth. We're scared that if we don't force people to do things, they will never do anything, and society will fall apart. But this belief flies in the face of all common sense, reason, and science. Contemporary understandings of competition, respect, and man's need for self-actualization demonstrate that man has a deep-rooted biological motivational system. Marx talked about alienation from our species essence, Kaczynski called it disruption of the power process, McGonagall calls it a lack of flow and fear in the workplace. I posit here they are all saying the same thing. That human beings not only have the ability to self-motivate, they have an instinctive and fundamental need to self-motivate. Marx reached this conclusion through economics, Kaczynski through sociology, and McGonagall through the fields of psychology and neurology. Mankind is not so different from wolves, lions, bees, ants, and the many other social species we see in nature. It is our biological destiny to work with one another, for one another. There is ample evidence of this in gaming, and every gamer knows it. Just look at the incredible projects people will do for no pay at all, but simply because it's some shit the world needs to see. One-to-one replicas of the Death Star and Earth itself in Minecraft, the vast and incredible projects being produced by the thousands in the Skyrim modding community, people speedrunning Halo Lasso, streamers beating Dark Souls with bananas for controllers, massive megalopolises and skylines that people literally spend months building so they can meticulously plan out, the infrastructure, education, healthcare, and economy for a simulated population of hundreds of thousands, all of that passion you felt about your favorite games, the hours you spent harvesting resources to build bases in Rust, building empires in EVE Online, watching countless tutorials to learn new characters on Overwatch, studying in-depth hero builds to perfect your League of Legends strat, grinding iron ore production in RuneScape, meticulously exploring every last corner of a game for its Easter egg, the struggle you went through to get that one achievement that one time. Well, don't be ridiculous, Dukedobbins. These projects are nothing like real jobs. Quit kidding yourselves. A lot of those projects in the games we play actually are way fucking harder than plenty of jobs. They're just not as boring. Well, real jobs actually matter. No, actually, many of them don't. Most economists agree there's a glut of what they literally refer to as bullshit jobs. A great deal of work that is just as pointless as any in-game labor and is causing all kinds of mental health problems for workers, even high-paid workers, who gradually come to realize how meaningless their work is and feel sad about it. Has anyone stopped to consider how many jobs just boil down to hawking useless crap on people? There are thousands of people working in cotton candy factories. Is their labor really much more important than someone's city skyline shit? Cause with increasing frequency, they don't fucking think so. I had a friend who worked as a telemarketer selling newspaper subscriptions in 2020. An entire office of like 20 people cold calling boomers to scam them out of money for some shit they can get free online. What about sign spinners? What about the people still making phone books? What about when the Pentagon said it didn't need any more tanks, but Senator Portman was like, lol, yes you do, because he wanted to keep the tank factory open? What about sports analyst positions on ESPN? And it's not just the obvious stuff. The workers who feel most strongly their jobs are pointless tend to be well-paid receptionists, customer service, and HR reps. Researchers estimate the number of people who think their work is imaginary bullshit could be as high as 40%. Our economy has become just like a high school performance. The laborers aren't there to provide anything useful for society. Rather, society has to generate fake needs or excessive consumer demand so that the laborer has an excuse to exist. God forbid we should all stop eating cotton candy, because then the system won't have any reason to keep the cotton candy people alive. And this is exactly how we openly discuss it. We patronize workers by telling them they should be grateful we've given them work. Imagine admitting to the kids in a high school performance that they are actually so worthless. They should be grateful we even showed up to their shitty play, and realize this is the patronizing attitude we've beaten into our workers for a century. Okay, we'll pretend to need something so we don't have to kill you off. And they believe it. They believe they're worthless without these bullshit jobs. Society should be grateful for its workers. Workers should not be grateful for being given an excuse to live. That is something they are entitled to from birth, regardless of whether or not the bars are open right now. Our in-game labor is in fact the more authentic human experience. It's grinding, it's pain, it's loss, it's the humiliation of people killing you and taking your things, destroying your base in front of you and dipping their virtual balls in its rubble. That sinking pit in your stomach when hours upon hours of hard work go down the drain in an instant. Of loss streaks and getting in fights with your friends about the stupid characters they're picking, about how they're not pulling their weight in damage output or resource production, or just because they have a bad attitude and they're not taking the shit seriously. It's not just about fun, it's about feeling something in this barren, regimented hellscape we've been forsaken to. How excited and passionate you feel about your labor in video games is how excited and passionate you're supposed to feel about your labor in real life. It's the same passion your ancestors felt when they left the caves to find fire, when they built their first thatch huts and hunted animals on horseback, when they built their first boats and set sail across the oceans, when our forefathers left the shores of England to build new cities, when they left those cities to manifest destiny in the west, to master new terrain and dig deep into the earth for oil, to build new machines so we could conquer the sky and put a flag on the fucking moon. We aren't addicted to video games. There is no such thing. We're addicted to life. and to break that addiction is to kill our own soul and surrender ourselves to the abyss. Many might say that real life can never be as fun as video games, but I strongly disagree. A free life will be more fun than video games. Life itself is the ultimate video game. It's the OG, the inspiration for every game that came after. I love gaming, but no thrill has compared to writing. To the toil and struggle of the video I labor on now, this project which has consumed me for longer than I care to admit, pumped full of pills and espresso for months on end, it's driven me to the brink of insanity. It's as if I've been running on fumes for 10 years, since those first early mornings doing MW3 videos in Grandma's garage, as if it's all led to this one final project and I worry God will kill me off when I'm done, because it was all he needed from me and I cringe in the morning knowing these pages will be there staring me in the face. And yet I would have it no other way. It is the greatest joy of my life, for I never feel more alive than when I'm plotting revenge on the system. I love video games, but I pity the nihilist who genuinely believes that real life couldn't compete with fucking Minecraft. If given the opportunity and left to their own devices, human beings will seek to make the most of themselves and contribute to the world around them. If we adopt this more reasonable understanding of human nature, we can make significant changes to our public policy. What kind of changes? For starters, no more fucking homework. 4-day school weeks, and a greater amount of student choice over what they learn and when they learn it. Every study done on homework has shown it has no effect on people's knowledge retention. Students are forgetting 95% of what they are learning in class 3 days after they learn it. Scientists have found this is because the brain filters out useless information, and after the test, kids no longer have any use for what they've learned. Meanwhile, if we understand that schooling is a form of labor, as it requires significant amounts of time and mental energy, the same as many entry-level jobs, then we realize that by demanding the full extent of energy and time available to a child, the child is robbed of any opportunity to develop their own talents and marketable skills, and is disincentivized to do so anyways, having a basic faith that the system is properly preparing them for the future, when in fact we know it's not. Because our classrooms don't actually develop real skills. They basically try to get kids to memorize as much information as possible about a wide range of very broad subjects, but are failing miserably even by this metric. This leaves the child intellectually neutered, trained only to follow instructions and memorize things they are incapable of solving problems that don't come with directions. They will be dependent on low-wage, low-skill jobs provided to them by somebody else, because they don't know how to do anything else, unless of course they go to college and drop $100K on usurious student loans and overpriced textbooks just to find out that they still have the same fucking problem. And the only jobs they can do now are the ones that pay slightly better, but still require skills simple enough to be learned in a month of on-the-job training, which means the only jobs they'll get to do are those dull, repetitive, soul-sucking jobs which hundreds of millions of Americans are now stuck in, which we know they hate and which we know are killing them. The most common occupations in the United States are retail sales, cashiers, servers, and office clerks. Lame. Marx argued that free time was essential to the growth of the individual, that every hour taken from us was an hour we didn't have for the development of ourselves, to maximize our own productive power. We are born as undeveloped real estate. We can turn ourselves into great skyscrapers, factories, parks, but as it is, we never have the chance to be anything more than an empty lot, and so all we're good for is free parking and Christmas tree sales. For adults, it's time we have a serious discussion about universal basic income. The concept of UBI is regularly laughed off by opponents as wildly unrealistic, but keep in mind, advocates of UBI include such men as former President Barack Obama, U.S. Treasury Secretaries James Baker and Henry Paulson, who served under Reagan and Bush, respectively, Elon Musk, Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg, the fucking Pope, and historically included such advocates as Founding Father Thomas Paine, founder of analytic philosophy Bertrand Russell, and of course, the activist preacher Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who wrote a book advocating for what he called a guaranteed income shortly before his assassination in 1967. To write these men off as naive dreamers takes a level of hubris that is beyond my comprehension. Now, what exactly is universal basic income? Well, you remember the first month of coronavirus when they sent every adult in the US a check for $1,200 to keep the economy stimulated? What if they did that all the time, enough to guarantee every citizen's physical survival? Now, of course, any sensible person would then ask, how can we afford such a thing? This is a wonderful question, Sarah. Thank you for asking. We will afford it the same way we afforded it during the COVID crisis. To pull through that shit, we expanded the deficit by $2 trillion over 2 months. We spent $2 trillion that we didn't have. How is the government able to do that? It's not like they rapidly raised an extra $2 trillion in taxes. It didn't take a $2 trillion loan from Wells Fargo. What we did was we printed $2 trillion. We just conjured the wealth practically out of thin air. Which sounds crazy, but this is how the government has been paying for its biggest projects for most of the last century, so it's important we understand how this system works. Because the US government can print its own money, it can, in theory, throw any sum of money at any problem when it needs to, which is exactly what it does. But there is a catch: inflation. The more new money you pump into the system, the less valuable all money itself becomes. To the point where one day you wake up and an ice cream cone costs $500 and everyone's savings has been wiped out. So anytime the government uses this incredible power to inject printed money into the system, it must offset inflation by pulling money out of the system at the same time. We typically do this by selling US bonds. Bonds are loans to the government. I give the Fed $100 now, in a couple years they give me $200 back. Investors love US bonds because it's a super safe way to make money without having to do anything. So the US takes these loans from people to suck up the amount of currency necessary to offset inflation. And the total sum of those loans constitutes our national debt. We draw money out of the economy at the top so that we can blast a shitload in at the bottom. Now, the reason we are able to service that debt is because when we inject printed money into the system, it stimulates significant amounts of economic growth that ultimately lets the government turn a profit in real value on the printed money it conjured out of nowhere. For example, during the crisis, we had to shut everything down. Now nobody's got a job. And if they don't have jobs, they're not going to be able to spend money in all these other places, and those places are going to have to cut jobs too. And then even more people won't have money to spend, and we'll lose even more jobs, and so on and so forth till we're in a depression. Now, you'll notice wealth isn't being destroyed in this scenario. It's just that wealth has stopped circulating. So to avoid a depression, we printed a fuckload of money and sent everybody $1,200. What happens? They spend it. Instacart blows up, Zoom and Discord subscriptions blow up, Amazon deliveries blow up. Now all those places are hiring to meet the influx of demand. Grocery stores still have customers, so they don't have to let anyone go. And they'll still be importing apples from the apple orchard people and milk from the dairy farms, so all those suppliers don't have to cut jobs either. Because these people don't lose their jobs, they're able to keep spending money at businesses, which means those businesses will be able to pay people to work, which means those workers will be able to spend money at businesses. What a beautiful cycle. This is what we call stimulating the economy. Now, what's happening every time that $1,200 in paper money changes hands? It's generating labor and goods. So our GDP, how we measure the size of our economy, is the sum of all our goods and services. Well, when that $1,200 has circulated back and forth, 10 times over, it ends up generating more GDP than the original $1,200 was worth in paper. In the simplest possible analogy, imagine you print a $20 bill and you pay someone to pick $20 worth of apples. Now they've added $20 worth of goods to our GDP. Then the apple picker takes that $20 and pays someone else to hunt a deer. Now we've added $20 worth of apples and a $20 deer hide to our economy for a total of $40 worth of goods using only the single $20 bill that we printed out of nowhere. This is how we generate real GDP growth out of paper money. And higher GDP means higher tax revenues for the government, letting the government turn a profit off the printed money it injected, which allows the government to keep servicing its debt, which means the bondholders turn a profit and everybody makes money without anyone's tax rates necessarily having to be raised. It's natural for people to be skeptical of printed money as a concept. The way we often talk about currency today is as a stand-in for physical capital, because this is how we rationally think about it from a personal perspective, right? Okay, this $10 represents one McDonald's cheeseburger. And if you think about it that way, you might wonder, well, how can we just put money into the system when it isn't representing anything real? But then, how can the money we spent on that cheeseburger be real after we ate the damn cheeseburger? Because physical goods are disappearing all the time. So that's not what gives paper money value. That's not what it's tied to. It's tied to our labor. How much labor is available? It is a magical force that draws labor out of people, motivating everything it touches. It's like electricity moving through a game console that would otherwise just be a useless hunk of metal. And when we look at it this way, the only thing that limits how much money we can inject into this system is how many hours of labor are available. We don't want to inject more money than there's labor available, because then the money wouldn't generate any growth and would only increase inflation. But so long as there is labor available, there is no reason not to seek its activation through stimulus. So the debate on the affordability of universal basic income turns on this question. If you guarantee people's survival by giving them enough money for food and shelter, will they continue to contribute labor? Right now, the consensus is no. Most people feel that if you give people the means to survive, they will never work again a day in their lives. But there's no data to suggest this is actually what would happen, because even the meager amount of government assistance presently available do not cause labor participation decline. In fact, the EITC and the Alaska Permanent Fund have been shown to have the opposite effect. The massive stimulus bills we've had under Bush, Obama, and now Trump did not result in labor participation decline either. We know that's not how human nature works. If you provide for people's physical survival, they're going to continue to pursue needs further up Maslow's hierarchy, because people want more than to survive. They want more than food and a roof over their heads. They want respect, love, community, recognition, freedom, and self-actualization. If you give them just the bare minimum for what they need to survive, they're still gonna wake up one day and go, you know what? I want more than to just sit around eating ramen in my one-bedroom apartment. I want internet access. I want a cell phone. I want to travel. I want to learn the trombone. I want to be a part of something bigger than myself. I want to leave my mark on the world. I want to leave something better for my kids. I want to sleep with more women. I want a bigger apartment. I want a fucking penthouse at the top of the tallest skyscraper in New York City with a rooftop jacuzzi. I think our broken view of man as an inherently lazy beast is driven by the simple fact that we have come up in a grotesque system in which our concept of work is synonymous with the empty, soul-crushing intellectual prisons that are modern-day work and school, that we know we would abandon in a heartbeat, that we would, as Marx said, shed like the plague if we weren't coerced into it by threats to our survival. This nasty system, in which the only skill that truly matters is the ability to shut down your natural biological reward system, to ignore every part of your mind and body screaming at you that something isn't right, to pretend everything is just dandy when you know, deep down inside, you're actually really fucking sad all the time, and have been for longer than you can even remember. We all know this system is bullshit, we all hate it and we all want out, and nothing scares anybody more than the idea that someone else will break out and we won't. So we shame everyone into complacency and obedience under the guise of work ethic, but really our whole understanding of work ethic is as divorced from the science as the idea of a flat earth. Do not give in to this backwards, ignorant bullshit. Do not give in to the bitterness of the generations that preceded you and wasted their lives and want to shame you into wasting yours so they can feel better about it. I believe in the American people. I believe in the human spirit. Let this country off its leash. That dog will hunt. We used printed money to end the Great Depression and win World War II. We used printed money to recover from the 2008 recession and survive coronavirus. It is our go-to anytime there's an emergency. And when there isn't an emergency, the government still pumps that shit out for military research, corporate subsidies, and rich people's tax cuts. Anytime you hear about the deficit, which is how much more we're spending than we're taking in any year, all that is printed money. And we've been running at a deficit for most of the last 40 years. This isn't some wacky concept. This is the bread and butter of government finance. This is how the economy has been run for most of the last century. Anytime you hear about a stimulus package, they are talking about this shit. This is how we bailed out the banks in 2008. We funded both the Iraq and Afghanistan wars for 20 years with printed money. And during that period, we also did massive stimulus checks from both Bush and Obama. We're not arguing about whether or not the government should print and spend a fuckload of money. The government already does so, always has, and always will. What we're arguing about is what they spend the printed money on. And I'm just saying, I think the money would be better spent on me instead of playing 10-year-long games of WMD make-believe. Understand this, UBI will have to happen sooner or later. Anything less will result in complete economic and societal collapse. MLK might have advocated for it as a moral imperative, but guys like Zuckerberg aren't worried about charity, they're worried about the continued stability and functionality of human civilization. Zuckerberg, Elon Musk, Obama, these guys have a better idea than most about the power of AI and automation and the transformative effects it's going to have on the economy over the course of our lifetimes. They know that more and more jobs are going to be rapidly replaced by tech. They know there aren't going to be enough jobs for everyone going forward, not even close. And that if we continue to tie physical survival to having a job, we're going to end up with millions of people camping in tents on the fucking highway, mass poverty and death, and in all likelihood the violent revolution that always follows that shit. We're rapidly approaching a point where it's going to be like, well, Timmy just graduated, what does Timmy get to do? Sorry, Timmy, your ass is going out on the street because we don't got shit for you to do. We're going to have like China's one-child policy because there just aren't enough jobs, except it'll gradually be even less than a one-child policy, till eventually it's just one inbred family of Zuckerberg descendants ruling the whole world from some control center buried in San Francisco. Let us imagine a better future instead. With workers' base needs provided for, businesses will no longer be able to leverage the threat of homelessness and hunger to keep people in line. In negotiations with their employers, workers will have something they've never had before: the freedom to walk away. If there's a miserable, soul-sucking job that needs doing, companies will have to compensate workers generously enough to make it worth their time. This should be easy enough for any company to afford. With that amount of stimulus out on the streets, consumer demand will be higher than ever before. In this environment, anyone will be able to turn a profit on just about any good or service. Nobody will have to rely on Patreon, crowdfunding, GoFundMes, or whatever other desperate donation-based bullshit we've used to keep important projects afloat that otherwise don't get funded, not because there isn't demand for them, but just because there's so little wealth down here at the bottom. And if a company still can't afford to pay their workers properly, well, I guess they're gonna go out of business then. And good riddance. For too long, too many employers have propped up their shitty business models and shittier products on the labor of wage slaves. If you can't beat the game without coerced labor cheat codes, then you don't deserve to. At long last, we will separate this nation's legitimately talented capitalists from its trust fund fucktards. The American worker would have the power to reject the raw deal they've been given. The 82 million Americans who currently receive 0 vacation days could finally tell their employers to go fuck themselves. Working class mothers wouldn't have to use their sick days to give birth and show up to work 2 days after delivery. Serious injury or illness wouldn't mean financial ruin and getting left behind to die like a fucking animal. At long last, the American people will be free. A fundamentally stronger negotiating position with employers would mean every person had more control over how many hours they worked and when they worked them. No longer would it simply be workers competing for jobs, it would be jobs competing for workers too. By offering more flexibility and better pay, every worker would be able to afford themselves the free time they needed. Free time that the research tells us is so incredibly important for people's mental health and personal development. At long last, we will heal. Too many of us are plagued by decades-old ghosts we never had the time to confront. Too many have spent too much time running on fumes, choking on sadness they don't understand and can't fix, eventually giving in to this poisoned view that that's how it's supposed to be and that life itself is purposeless. For too long, too many people have felt like nobody gives a shit they exist. Well, viewer, I give a shit you exist. And it's time for a wake-up call. This isn't fucking purgatory, and life is a gift, not meant to be simply endured, but cherished and celebrated. Gallows humor about suicide has become too common across the internet. What the American people need now is some time to themselves. To smoke pot and ride horses. To sit around all day eating junk food, fucking, and watching Netflix with someone they love. A chance to decompress and enjoy a day without having to mentally block the dread of waking up for school tomorrow. A chance to feel alive without having to get fucking plastered. A chance to feel better without having to get numb on antidepressants and Fireball. A chance to travel, and really travel, not as some vacation every now and then you use to recuperate in preparation for the next month's long, dreadful slog, but as a journey to see all that there is in this incredible playground we call Earth. Families, scattered across the nation by their respective employment, will finally be able to visit one another without cringing over the expense and loss of what little free time they have. We will have time to spend with one another, the energy to get to know people, and I know this sounds crazy, but I honestly think Americans might just find out that we like each other. This kind of healing would be so much more valuable than any war won, or tax cut, or trade deal, or new cell phone, or whatever other bullshit we pretend is justifying this cruel, banal clown show existence. And if history is any guide, Americans will use this free time to do the most significant work they've ever done, and will see the greatest economic expansion in human history. For it was stuck at home under quarantine that Shakespeare wrote King Lear and Munch painted the Scream. Newton discovered gravity, Ben Franklin electricity, and Einstein relativity, all on their own free time, at home, not at the behest of an employer, but of their own volition, driven by curiosity and ambition. We know now that free time is what makes great minds great. Books like Daily Rituals and Outliers have thoroughly documented the rise of history's greatest minds, showing that usually they stuck to strict, individualized routines, often with eccentric sleeping patterns, diets, and workspaces. Some woke up early, took long walks, and practiced celibacy. Others stayed up all night, took drugs, and fucked everything that walks. Everyone seemed to have their own, often contradictory method for creative optimization, but what they all had in common was freedom. Freedom to dedicate specific hours of their day to specific activities as they saw fit, to set their own work hours, choosing when they went to sleep and woke up, and taking naked air baths, as Ben Franklin called them, in the middle of the day. Gladwell observed that genius typically arises through a mostly self-directed process in which a skill is practiced for at least 10,000 hours, and that innate ability doesn't even matter if you come from a dysfunctional background, that plenty of high IQs fall short without strong social or financial support. And if you read those books, you'll notice that almost none of their stories would have been possible had they been working class in 2020. When half of our full-time workers are averaging 47 hours of labor a week just to survive, there simply isn't room in the schedule for an entire kooky routine of long walks, amphetamines, and nocturnal sleep cycles you personally designed for your individual creative optimization. And does the typical worker have 10,000 hours to spare, an extra 20 a week for 10 years? Of course not. And what is our present environment, if not dysfunctional, in which millions of kids go hungry every day and so many millions more are severely depressed and lonely? Just think of all the human potential we're missing out on. We're talking Mozart, Freud, Einstein, Picasso, Sylvia Plath and Jane Austen, Bill Gates, Oppenheimer, and the Beatles. Imagine how many of our generation's Darwins, Jeffersons, and Beethovens are out there right now, but we'll never see their contributions because they never had the chance to develop their potential. But if we reversed course and provided every citizen with the freedom to reach their maximum potential, if we unlocked the fucking Beethoven inside all of us, imagine what the world would look like then. There would always be a new Netflix show to binge, a new movie to see, new concerts to attend, and restaurants to eat at. A world of infinite content. Our cities would be magnificent, with new millions of the world's greatest architects locked in endless rivalry to outdo one another. Our scientists, inventors, and athletes would push their fields to frontiers we couldn't imagine. Every day would bring a new Mozart, a new Thomas Jefferson, and by God, maybe even a new B. Dobbins FTW. To step into any person's home will be to enter a new galaxy, for even the most lowly Fred Flintstone motherfuckers among us will be producing wondrous home gardens, baked goods, glass-blown structures, and whatever other hobbies they felt like fucking around with each day of their bountiful lives. We would realize that there's more to be experienced in the imagination of any one of us than in the whole physical universe itself. Every novel, show, and song you have ever enjoyed began as mere thoughts in someone's head. You have only tasted a drop of what your fellow man has to offer. It is time we open the floodgates. You are a beautiful flower. You will thrive and the world will be a better place for having tasted your nectar. And just imagine the gaming. No longer would we spend 8 months a year with our thumbs up our asses waiting for those 4 big releases in the fall. We'd be seeing major releases like that every month. Major projects like Star Citizen and the Elder Scrolls Engine overhaul wouldn't be distant crowdfunded dreams we wait 10 years for and then never happen. They'd be standard content drops that we worry we won't have enough time to get to. There's so much other shit we gotta play. And the biggest games would be able to take things further than ever before. Grand Theft Auto International Syndicate, a full-size simulation of the entire fucking planet. From Tokyo to New York to Paris to goddamn Sydney. And so mankind arrives at its climax, in which the stakes have never been higher. Either our civilization will descend into tyranny and desolation, or else rise to this occasion and deliver the greatest society the world has ever known. And so it lies with us, my fellow gamers, to prevent the former and secure the latter. But to do so, there is one last obstacle we must overcome. The American Super PAC. If capitalism is a Call of Duty match, this is the most powerful killstreak reward of all time. Imagine if for a 25 killstreak reward you won the ability to change the rules of the fucking game. Imagine if the only people who were allowed to design Call of Duty were the players who had the highest KDs already. What kind of rule changes do you think we'd see? I know the kind of cruel shit I would have come up with. I would make it so you weren't allowed to leave a match no matter how bad you were getting farmed. I would make it so you can't start earning killstreak rewards till you've taken a certain amount of deaths. I would make it 25 kills for a fucking UAV. And for those of us already on top, I would make it so 2 KD players get their first 3 streak rewards free at the start of every match. I'd make it so your KD itself was a streak multiplier, letting every kill count as 2 towards your streak. I'd let high KD players' bullets do more damage, health regenerate faster, sprint last longer. If I had the power to design the game, I'd make sure that those of us on top stayed on top, no matter what. Well, this is exactly what's going on in real life. This is why banks get government bailouts, but regular people aren't even allowed to declare bankruptcy on student loans. This is why stocks are up and the rich are seeing massive profits while the rest of America is faced with recession and loss of livelihood, just like in 08. Because the key difference between COD and capitalism is that in video games, developers are a kind of godlike force, separated from the game itself, having no personal stake in any match's outcome, and are only incentivized to maximize player satisfaction. Whereas the developers in real life, our policymakers, are players in the match the same as anybody else, which inevitably leads us to conflicts of interest, where although elected officials are supposed to prioritize the public good, they often prioritize their own personal interests instead, be it their net worth or re-election chances, which leaves them open to corrupt influence. The American aristocracy seized control of the United States in 2 phases. Phase 1 was accumulating all of the money. This was accomplished handily over the last 50 years using trickle-down economics and the natural exponential growth in capital gains we have discussed. Phase 2 is making sure money has all the power. This was accomplished in 2010 via the Citizens United Supreme Court ruling, which allows both private individuals and corporations to spend unlimited amounts of money on politics via super PACs. Essentially, right now, any person in America can donate any amount of money to any politician they want. If that system seems ripe for abuse to you, the court itself agreed, so to prevent a corrupt system of bribery, in which politicians simply tailor their positions to whoever gave them the most money, the court ruled that these donations must be made to a politician's super PAC, and the politician isn't allowed to be in charge of or coordinate with said super PAC. The problem is, this teensy tiny safeguard the court used as justification doesn't actually work because it's basically unenforceable. Okay, so they can't share an office or exchange memos, but you know what politicians can still do with people who work for their PAC? Hang out together at home, have dinner together, attend events together, play golf. Who's running this candidate's super PAC? Just his best friend who worked for him up till a week ago. And if they just happen to have one offhand conversation in private where someone lets it slip, hey, we're running ads in Wisconsin and Florida targeting elderly voters to portray our opponent as weak and ineffectual, well, boom, now it's a single political organization and there's no way to prove they had that conversation unless they admit to it, which they won't, so it's impossible to stop them. And it's not like they even need to have that conversation in the first place. It doesn't take some kind of brain genius to see what ads a campaign is running and run some version of those yourself in the same places. And oftentimes, the politicians will literally refer to these supposedly independent super PACs as my super PAC. Media will refer to it as the Joe Biden super PAC, even though it would be technically illegal for it to be the Joe Biden super PAC. Sometimes campaigns will even just tweet out instructions to their super PACs, but so long as they don't tag the PAC's handle, they don't get in trouble. The politicians and media barely even pretend that this law is real. So there's no actual barrier separating campaigns and super PACs. Basically, they're just not allowed to email each other. So unfortunately, in practice, this ruling has legalized bribes. The Supreme Court's gross incompetence is a testament to how thoroughly American academia has failed. That they couldn't foresee how easily this rule would be bypassed speaks to an American intelligentsia that has spent way too much time sheltered in the classroom, convinced that rules written on paper are metaphysically inviolable, as if a sign that says don't play on the grass makes it physically impossible for anyone to do so. This is much worse than Infinity Ward not realizing people would abuse one-man army danger close noob tubes. The result is an American oligarchy. The wealthy elite are able to use super PACs to train our politicians like dogs. There never has to be an explicitly stated quid pro quo. Wealthy interest groups will donate to politicians, oftentimes they'll donate to candidates on both sides of a race, and if your stated policy positions and votes on legislation align with what the interest group wants, the amount they donate to you will go up. Otherwise, they will donate less and donate more to your opponent. Lobbyists may or may not make this clear to a candidate in direct terms, but again, they don't need to, because just like a dog learns that it gets treats when it behaves and punishment when it doesn't, so too do the politicians learn to obey their masters. Because the politicians know that bribes are what win elections. In America, the better funded candidate wins 91% of the time. In high-profile races, or races where both sides are spending a ridiculous sum of money, i.e. for the presidency, it can become kind of a wash. But most races are not high-profile. Congressional seats, state legislatures, city councils, school boards, these are the elections decided by the highest bidder. Why? Because the better funded candidate can spend $1 billion on ads across televisions and computers saying their opponent is a criminal animal abuser who fucks chickens. If said opponent doesn't also have $1 billion to spend, he'll never be able to get the word out that he is not in fact a criminal chicken fucker. These races aren't important enough to garner the kind of news coverage that would be necessary to fact check one side or the other's bullshit. The average citizen understandably does not have the expertise, extra time, or energy available to do fact checks themselves for the dozens of races they're asked to decide every year, so the candidate with the most ads will always win. Therefore, the candidate who takes the most bribes will always win. Therefore, the people with the most money will decide who wins most elections. New York billionaires are choosing Texas state legislators. It makes no sense. And even if you get the person you want in the White House or any other single race, our constitutional system won't let them defy the will of the 91% of other races being decided by the ruling class. It's completely fucked. Everything in life boils down to incentive structures. The way we play any game is dictated by what goals the game instructs us to pursue. Never forget that. Nobody understands incentive structures better than gamers, and nobody understands better how fucking stupid a game can be when the incentive structures are broken. I genuinely believe you are the only people in the country right now who can fully grasp just how fucking stupid the game is we are all playing right now. America makes Anthem and Fallout 76 look like masterpieces. And understand this, these people like things the way they are. This country has a long history of elites mistrusting the general public. This goes back to the Founding Fathers. That's why we have the Senate and the Electoral College, both of which were intended to be a check on public passions. Originally, regular citizens weren't even allowed to vote for their senators. The electors in the Electoral College were meant to overrule the public if the public made a bad choice. There are cogent, well-articulated arguments for elite rule, rooted in philosophy and backed by influential Founding Fathers like Hamilton. The oligarchs know they rule the country. They cling to this age-old philosophy of the elite to justify it. They are afraid of mob rule. They take a dim view of the public. They think you are ignorant, emotional, and prone to irrational behavior. They think it is in everyone's best interests that they rule you. They understand this system comes at a great cost to you, to your freedom and your opportunity, but it is a sacrifice they are willing to make. They will fight hard to defend this system. Ultimately, super PACs have allowed the wealthy elite to seize control of both major political parties, and both major parties rely on the culture wars for social control. On the left, the Democrats talk a lot about inequality and overturning Citizens United, but in reality there's a certain line they will never cross, and that line is drawn by their donors. It means letting concerns about the deficit limit stimulus spending, it means tying stimulus programs to coerce labor, it means raising taxes on the donor class but never by too much. It means bailing out banks and refusing to prosecute elites even when they're caught red-handed. It means passing Mitt Romney's healthcare bill and calling it progressive. In this, Democrats are possibly the more dangerous party because they consume all the resources and votes of opposition to elite rule, thereby starving out other potential opposition movements, but without themselves ever actually providing real opposition. It is wealthy elites providing the public with the illusion of a choice, thereby keeping them in control. If politics were a courtroom and Democrats were a defense attorney, they would be criminally prosecuted for extreme and deliberate ineffective assistance of counsel. On their left flank, the so-called AOC wing of the party offers a more legitimate repudiation of elite rule, but they will never accomplish anything so long as they prioritize the culture wars over economic justice. When AOC condemned Bernie Sanders for accepting Joe Rogan's endorsement during the primaries, she made it clear that culture war issues still take precedence over forming a coalition against the elite.
This was a grave mistake. A coalition between the political stripes that make up Sanders supporters and Rogan's audience would have been very effective. The new leftists and the disaffected centrists and right-wingers who form Rogan's audiences are, believe it or not, actually on the same side on a lot of issues. They all vaguely sense that something is fundamentally unfair in this country, that there's a lack of freedom and opportunity. AOC undercut Sanders at a pivotal moment in the race, splintering the left and ultimately throwing the race to Biden. It's also important to remember that while Sanders was considered the furthest left candidate on economic issues, he was by far the most moderate candidate on cultural issues. Letting the fact that Rogan has interviewed certain people you don't like completely blow up that coalition is the biggest shooting yourself in the foot moment I've ever seen. Painting NASCAR F1s black, tearing down statues, these things don't actually move us closer to any goal in particular. It was Dr. King who argued strenuously that racial justice and economic equality were inextricably linked, that you could not have one without the other. By expending so much energy and shunning so many potential allies in the pursuit of culture war issues and symbolic victories, we abandon the strategy laid out to us by the working class's greatest advocate and tactician. This fundamental failure is not limited to the left by any means, however. Donald Trump is a culture war president. In 2016, he ran on an economic platform that was strikingly similar to Bernie Sanders. He wanted to use deficit spending on infrastructure stimulus, he wanted to protect government benefits, and of course he generally made a big deal about sticking it to the economic elite. But in practice, his policies have done just the opposite. His major legislative accomplishment, the 2017 Tax Cut and Jobs Act, cut corporate taxes by 15%, while cutting individual tax rates by only 3%. The corporate rates are permanent. The individual rates expire, which means long-term, this is essentially another massive financial handout to the oligarchs. They'll now have more money than ever to spend on super PACs, meaning they are the most powerful they have ever been. Of course, the oligarchs would argue that everyone does better when they have more money to invest in the economy. This is the crux of supply-side or trickle-down economic theory. The effect of supply-side tax cuts on the entire economy's overall growth remains a highly controversial subject. But what we do know with certainty is that it can't fix wealth inequality. After all, 4 of our last 6 presidents passed sweeping supply-side tax cuts. And during that time, wealth inequality has only gotten much worse, because the fundamental flaw remains. The rate of return on capital gains will always outpace economic growth, so giving the wealthiest more money means they will only make even more money that much faster, thereby increasing their political power, which they can then use to, you guessed it, pass even more tax cuts. You'll notice, during his bid for re-election, the president rarely talked about the tax cut bill, despite it being his signature achievement in office. Instead, he ramped up the culture wars. This is the model most politicians from both parties follow. You campaign on a culture wars platform, and then you legislate on an oligarch's platform. Because culture war issues are the one area where political establishments can thread the needle between the donor class and their voters. Because the donor class doesn't actually give a shit about the statues, abortions, who gets canceled, whether or not a woman is vice president for the first time. So politicians can take up these causes to convince their voters they're fighting for them, when really, behind the scenes, they are actively working against their economic interests. They rely on the hate and mistrust that the culture wars stir in us to keep people divided who would otherwise form a coalition to advance their collective economic interests. Sadly, the culture wars are the worst they've ever been, and are unlikely to get better anytime soon. In part, this is because of social media. In part, it's because our leaders deliberately troll us against one another to retain power. But on a deeper level, I really think all of this anger is driven by the mental health epidemic we're in the midst of. I think Americans have devoted their lives to their jobs, and these jobs have not provided them with the psychological fulfillment or financial stability they desperately need. This has led to feelings of acute stress, inadequacy, depression, loneliness, and poor emotional regulation overall. Everyone is pissed off and sad, and they're not sure why. They're looking for someone to blame. The oligarchs are desperate we blame one another, so we don't notice the oppressive economic circumstances that made us so angry in the first place. America has become a self-sustaining ecosystem of greed, stupidity, and hatred. Economic power is political power. So long as the ruling elite has all the money, they will have all the power and our oppression will continue. We must address our extreme wealth inequality not just for the sake of economic stability, but for the survival of political equality in the United States. There's only one long-term solution to this problem that allows both capitalism and society to survive: a wealth tax. A wealth tax would be applied to the top 1% of earners as an annual rate on the total value of their personal assets, including cash, bank deposits, real estate, financial securities, and personal trusts. A flat across-the-board tax is necessary because otherwise we know wealthy individuals will simply find clever ways to work around whatever other tax code we implement. It's not about what the revenue is spent on. Use it to fund UBI, pay down the debt, build a space elevator, I don't care. All that matters is that the richest 91,000 people at the top of the country don't have it anymore. This will prevent the exponential growth on capital gains that allows top earners to outpace the economy's total growth, and thus rein in the outsized influence on politics their wealth gives them. Because even if you did manage to reform Citizens United, so long as they still have all that money, history shows us they will find some other way to exert their will.
UBI would do a lot for people's quality of life, but we will still be ruled by an unelected oligarchy if we don't address inequality. I know we all hate the T word, because many feel strongly that our billionaires are entitled to every dollar they earn, and that even if such a tax is sensible, it is not fair or moral to redistribute wealth from the top back to the bottom. But this is a broken way of viewing our economic system. The truth is, every billionaire's success is completely dependent on government and their fellow Americans. For one, consider how billionaires today are earning so much of their money. Howard Schultz, CEO of Starbucks, is a wonderful coffee salesman. He came up with great coffee recipes and set up supply chains to sell coffee around the world. He has brought caffeine to the people and generated a great deal of economic growth, and for this I praise him. I'm grateful for my venti blonde roast, and I'm impressed with those parts of the system that allowed Starbucks to thrive. But I also know that none of Mr. Schultz's success would be possible without the government enforcing property rights and backing a common currency. Free markets do not exist in a vacuum. They rely on government, and the countrymen who operate and fund that government. It is government that ensures everyone Starbucks does business with honors their contracts, that every Starbucks is physically protected from rivals and criminals, that every supply chain from Beijing to New York is secure. It is government that provides and protects the infrastructure. The highways, electricity, running water, internet that make Starbucks' business model possible, that makes the lives of every customer and employee they have possible. It is the millions of construction workers, utilities workers, law enforcement, military, firefighters, accountants, farmers, truckers, and so many others who keep this system running. It is the nurses and teachers who keep all those other workers competent and healthy. Without all these people busting ass all day, Mr. Schultz's great ideas would never be anything more than ideas. It's not as if he could have walked out into the forest, started making coffee, and somehow magically spawned a global empire that lets him turn his coffee into mansions, cars, boats, food, and entertainment for himself. The wealthy success would not be possible without the system. Therefore, they are indebted to the millions of working class Americans who make that system run. They do not owe any particular dollar figure. What they owe is what's promised in the Constitution. The Constitution is a social contract in which free people agree to obey a set of laws and in return are guaranteed certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. As I've argued, it's increasingly clear these rights are not secured for a rapidly growing number of Americans. We do not control the government. We do not control our own lives. And as the present crisis shows, our very right to survival itself is apparently negotiable. The wealthy are obliged to pay whatever amount of tax is necessary to ensure that the system upholds its constitutional obligations to the millions of Americans who make that system work. Otherwise, the system itself is rendered illegitimate, as is any wealth they have acquired through it. It is irrelevant what dollar value the market has assigned any particular laborer. The free market is a game of make-believe that only works because we all agree to live by it. But when the social contract is broken, as it increasingly seems to be, then nobody is obliged to play along anymore. It is flagrantly unconstitutional for the government to leave its citizens no other choice than to participate in a system designed and enforced by government when that system robs them of liberty in any practical sense or otherwise threatens them with death by deprivation. If the government is to require our participation in this system, then the government is obviously obliged to protect our natural rights to life and liberty within it. For these reasons, a UBI and wealth tax are not only sensible policy, but constitutional obligations, which until fulfilled, leave the government in violation of its oaths. It is no surprise we see such a sharp rise in protest movements and armed militias. The public is rapidly losing faith in the social contract. Even if many cannot articulate specifically what is wrong, the average citizen is aware of their mistreatment. The COVID crisis has thrown into stark relief the failings of our system. Our college-educated doctors, politicians, and business elite clearly have no idea what's going on or how to fix it. Tens of millions of Americans who gave literally every productive hour of their lives to this system are being evicted from their homes and left on the streets. Not because they refuse to participate, but because the system doesn't have anything for them to do right now. And so there is no excuse for their survival. Many people are about to realize they've been forced into dependency on a system that is wholly unreliable. A system that takes everything from you when times are good and leaves you with nothing when the going gets rough. When this is over, many will call for a return to the way things were. This is unacceptable and foolish. The way things were is how we got here in the first place. COVID is a fucking tea party compared to the challenges that await us. The climate crisis, a rising China, not to mention more pandemics. We cannot afford another decade of leadership from hereditary oligarchs and teachers' pets. These morons are going to get us all killed. I worry they do not realize how fragile the system is. I worry they are making the same errors they made with super PACs. They don't realize that words on paper won't matter after a certain point. A lot of people are about to get screwed over very badly. If history is any guide, they're not going to go away. There will be a reckoning. To enact the reform necessary to save America from itself, we must first break the oligarchs' grip on our government and economy. We cannot expect them to ever voluntarily pass legislation that would restrict their own power, as a wealth tax and UBI would do. They must be forced to. This must be done non-violently.
Violence is unethical and also only ever strengthens the system by giving it an excuse to increase its power and delegitimize its detractors. But the flaccid protests that regular people have relied on for the last 2 decades are clearly a futile exercise also. Occupy Wall Street, a massive nationwide protest lasting months, accomplished nothing. Massive prolonged climate marches across the globe, accomplished nothing. Pro-life marches, nothing. Gun control marches after Sandy Hook, nothing. Hong Kong protests, nothing. It doesn't matter what side of any of the issues these protests you were on. Protests against police brutality have been widespread for the last decade. Trayvon Martin, Freddie Gray, Sandra Bland, dozens of other Black Americans whose unjust murder sparked marches that ultimately didn't solve the problem. This time around, the marches for Floyd were especially intense and embittered because people are starting to realize that their voices aren't being heard. This is because the system long ago stopped responding to popular will. It's not intimidated by protests in the street, why would it be? These demonstrations provide no tangible threat to the system's structure. People want to rely on street protests because street protests are actually kind of easy. You don't have to think very hard or sacrifice much. It means making signs and hanging out with your friends, oftentimes in a parade-like atmosphere, and then patting yourself on the back for making a difference when you haven't. This time around, a spate of symbolic victories were won. As usual, the system uses mostly hollow aesthetic concessions to convince people they've made progress when really not much has changed. Some police departments and local governments have made modest reforms, but many more have not. Most importantly, there's been no movement at the federal level. The central issues of police militarization and union impunity remain unchanged. Sooner or later, there will be another horrendous killing caught on camera, and next time, the protesters will be even angrier, and understandably so. Protests don't work anymore, they haven't for a long time. Defeating the oligarchs will require a more tactical form of civil disobedience. And so I ask you, my fellow gamers, what would we do if this were a video game? What we always do when a game is broken. We would stop playing it. And of course, this is exactly what many gamers are already doing. This all comes back to the Princeton study. Why did they zero in on games as the cause? Because usually unemployment is devastating to people's mental health, but somehow gamers are significantly happier than the employed. Usually unemployment means not having anything to do with yourself all day. It means not having the money to engage in recreation. It means not getting to meet new people or have any real social life at all. An infamous study on boredom found that when you stick people in a room with nothing to do but electrocute themselves, most of them will opt to electrocute themselves over and over again rather than just sit there and do nothing. This is the same dynamic in play with unemployment. No matter how terrible a job is, it's physiologically preferable to having nothing to do at all. Even if someone could afford not to work financially, they cannot endure it biologically. Video games change that. In video games, our social and psychological needs are provided for. We experience flow and Fiero. We develop meaningful relationships, experiences that were not available in past forms of recreation like TV and books. We have developed a surrogate activity powerful enough that it doesn't allow us to simply tolerate the system. It allows us to tolerate leaving the system. Games have a tremendous cost-value ratio. Free games like Fortnite, League, Dota, EVE, $20 games like Minecraft, Rocket League, and even $60 games like Skyrim or Overwatch are relatively cheap while providing thousands upon thousands of hours of entertainment, meaning gamers don't have to consume nearly as much to stay happy and entertained, limiting the system's ability to punish us financially. Video games break the system's most effective forms of leverage to coerce labor. This is the Achilles heel of an otherwise invulnerable beast. For this reason, we should embrace video games with a vigor and passion never seen before. That is why I am calling on all American gamers to exit the labor force, or otherwise, reduce your participation to the greatest extent possible relative to your means. Or, short of either of those things, every one of us must do all that we can to aid and abet any gamer who has exited the labor force. Every hour we work, the vast majority of the wealth we generate is appropriated by the oligarchy. This allows them to exponentially generate even more wealth that much faster. The total sum of this wealth is where they derive their political power. It is what allows them to rule the country and write the laws. The less you work, the less power they will have. It's that simple. Make no mistake, they've already recognized the mortal threat video games pose to their rule. That is why even the modest single-digit decline in the labor force we saw pre-pandemic sent them into a conniption fit. And they had their most elite colleges, global institutions, and the English monarchy attack gamers as out-of-control addicts. We must reject this propaganda. The reality is, gamers do not have much in common with other addicts. Other addicts, by every metric, are made unhappier and unhealthier by their addiction, while the research indicates the exact opposite is true for gamers. Furthermore, there's an inherent backwards logic in insisting these unemployed gamers give up their happiness for the sake of the system, when the whole point to any system is supposedly to provide happiness, to allow the human condition to flourish, to let us lead fulfilling lives. And do not pretend that they owe it to others to participate when the central pillar of our economic system is supposed to be ruthless self-interest balanced against others' ruthless self-interest. As President Reagan would declare, that greed is good, a system in which altruism is actively disdained, in which every company justifies how little it pays its workers by arguing they're not charities. Well, guess what, fuckheads?
Neither are the rest of us. By pursuing their own happiness and telling everyone else to fuck themselves, these gamers are simply doing exactly what they've been trained to do since birth. They don't owe it to anybody to sell their labor for less than what they think it's worth. We told everyone to be selfish. People are listening, and now the oligarchs are doing Pikachu face. By exiting the system's bum deal, we do what any proud capitalist would do. Sacrificing our health and happiness for a functional society defeats the purpose of a functional society. The more of us who demonstrate that we are happier outside the system, the more those inside it will be forced to question their participation. A reduced supply of labor means that the labor that stays is made more valuable. It means companies will have a harder time trying to replace people who ask for a raise. It means less competition for jobs and promotions. By taking our labor off the market, we strengthen the hand of any worker who does not have the option to. And of course, as gamers, we know that nothing makes a game change faster than when we stop playing it. Because when we stop playing a video game, the publishers react because they don't want to lose money. The same is true for the system. A reduced supply of labor means a smaller economy. It means less goods, or more expensive goods for everyone, increasing public dissatisfaction with the system. It means less tax revenue for the government. It means the government has less leverage in geopolitical affairs. It means less profit for every owner of capital. The oligarchs have already way overextended themselves, content that our labor would always be theirs to exploit. They've spent trillions and trillions of printed money on subsidies, bailouts, tax cuts, and oil wars. Even modest declines in the labor force will threaten their ability to keep up with servicing that debt. If we pressure them to earn our participation, they will be forced to do so. The workers are in fact the most important part of the system. It cannot survive without them. The oligarchs aren't scared of the coronavirus or the recession. These crises actually make them stronger by exacerbating inequality as this one is doing now. What they're afraid of is change. The government easily has the means to expand UI benefits, cover people's rents, and at a $3.8 trillion deficit, they basically could have done UBI this year. $1,200 checks to every citizen till the crisis passed. It wouldn't have been a problem, but they're afraid that regular people will figure out how powerful this tool is and how the oligarchs have been using it exclusively for themselves for the last 40 years. They're worried for the last 40 years. They're worried that if regular people figure out the truth, they will demand more from their government, that it will be harder to herd them back to work with the whip when this is over. The oligarchs have gaslit the public into believing we are all treading water in the middle of the ocean, and if we stop swimming, we will drown. What they don't want you to figure out is that there's a cruise liner right there with less than 1% of its cabins filled. Their goal right now is to weather the storm without us discovering the truth, so they'll provide the public the bare minimum until there's a vaccine, at which point the goal will be to get everyone back to work as quickly as possible to keep servicing the debts they've accrued to bail themselves out. But if enough of us didn't go back, they'd be fucked. An exodus from the labor force would send a wider message, not just to the oligarchs, but to everyone in the system who still thinks it works. Seeing a generation of young people in their prime labor years throwing their hands up and walking away would deal a spiritual blow to the national pride, piercing the bubble of complacency around the bourgeoisie. Obviously, a big part of the problem we've discussed is people not having the means to survive outside the system, and I wouldn't ask anyone to go hungry or risk harm. But there are a great many more who I think very easily could walk away. Over half of millennials are living with their parents now. I think many of these millennials could reduce their participation significantly or walk away entirely, just like all the young men in this Princeton study. Anyone who can reduce their participation even a little bit should do so. Every hour you take for yourself is a small victory, for you and the world. A double kill, so to speak. Is it worth doing 40 hours of recruiting or selling 5G chips on cold calls when you would be way happier doing just 20 hours of bartending on the beach where you belong? If there is one exception, it is for those who feel their labor is genuinely self-directed. Self-directed labor is the most healthy, beneficial thing for the individual and in the long-run society. Be honest with yourself about whether it's truly self-directed. Ask yourself, if UBI was passed tomorrow, and the government sent you enough money for rent and food every month, would you still do your job? Or would you take some time off to look for something else, or discover something else inside yourself? I don't think my stony, rambling call for a protest is even that necessary. Gamers' rejection of the system in favor of gaming started naturally, and I suspect will continue naturally, just as the researchers have predicted. I hope video game addiction spreads through the country like a fucking forest fire. And just as wildfires are nature's way of cleaning out undergrowth and dead trees so that new ones can grow, so too can gamers clean out this nation's decayed ways of thinking. But we must not let the system snuff out their flame, which it is clearly already trying to do. As discussed, respect is a form of social control, and it is the most powerful form of coercion the system uses to pressure people into work they detest. In this country, nobody is more universally reviled than the unemployed. I suspect many citizens could work a lot less, could live much more freely, but choose not to out of fear of cultural exile. Therefore, we must retire the outdated stereotypes that drive this social control by rejecting the belief system that undergirds them. Workism. Workism is our national religion. Workism is the belief that productivity is the purpose of life, that maximizing our day-to-day productivity should be every citizen's end goal. Workism is the belief that we should measure one another by our productivity and look down on anyone who isn't productive. Workism is about taking pride in feeling miserable and empty inside. You'll often hear its priests say some dumb shit like, well, I believe in hard work. But we now know, from a scientific standpoint, this is basically like saying I believe in having sex and eating food. Well, whoop-de-fucking-do, pal, me too. Workism is reality television stars telling us to take a bite of the shit sandwich, but of course what they don't tell you is that when they took a bite, there was a lot less shit in there and they were getting paid twice what you are to bite it. Marx argued that religion was a kind of opiate for the masses, that our fixation on an afterlife made us comfortable being forced to waste the entirety of our earthly lives. Today, I think we use the religion of workism to accomplish something similar. We are all miserable in these jobs, so we make ourselves feel better by saying that all this hard work is important, that we are the shit for doing it, and that we are better than lazy people. But just like in Marx's time, there's little real-world evidence to support this belief system. For the last 50 years, we've worked really fucking hard. We work longer hours, we work harder hours. And what has all this hard work gotten us? They say it's good for us, but by every measurement, everyone is worse off today than they were 50 years ago. Obesity, diabetes, heart disease, loneliness, anxiety, depression, and suicide have all only skyrocketed in that time, and continue to. We are unhappier and unhealthier than we were before all this hard work. They say it builds character, but today Americans hold themselves in the lowest regard ever, as does every other nation. They say hard work is good for the world, and yet our planet is dying, our democracy is broken, and our economy is teetering. The result of all this hard work is that we have lost everything and gained nothing. Workism tells us that the unemployed are a burden on the rest of society, but this belief is based on a profoundly ignorant understanding of the system we're in. It was made clear during the COVID lockdowns that society can support the essential needs of 100% of its population even when over half that population isn't working. Why? Because ESPN analysts, Facebook employees, game developers, none of these things actually have any effect on how much food and energy we're able to produce. And technology and industrial modes of production long ago gave us the technical capacity to meet the essential needs of our population twice over. Pre-pandemic, we were already throwing away nearly half of our food supply and wasting half the energy we produce. We are already in the early stages of what UBI advocates were warning about. Technology is allowing us to produce more resources than we know what to do with. The Panama Papers revealed that the super wealthy are hoarding somewhere between $10 and $20 trillion in offshore tax havens. That money isn't taxed, it's not even in circulation. The point is, we have the means, both in imaginary paper money and literal resources, to take care of everyone without it being a drag on anybody else. The oligarchy limits access to these resources because it would destroy their leverage. They like being able to coerce labor by using survival as a kind of metaphorical gun pointed at the back of your head. Fine, but don't argue that the unemployed are a burden on society when the burden itself is completely imaginary. It's something the system has imposed as a form of control. We have more than enough resources to guarantee everyone's survival. We could guarantee the unemployed survival with the shit we throw out. We choose not to. They don't need to use some people's tax dollars to take care of other people. It's only made necessary by the imaginary rules we live by. The unemployed are a burden on the oligarchs and their game of make-believe, not on anybody else. Hate the game, not the player. Workism is an irrational cultural belief that blinds us to the obvious absurdities in our system, that drives us to prioritize often fruitless productivity over our own quality of life, and that encourages us to turn on our own team. Ironically, the greatest problem we actually have right now isn't that we don't have enough for everyone. It's that we have too much, and we're running out of things for people to do, and so we don't have an excuse to give them any of the resources that we have too much of. By exiting the labor force, or otherwise reducing our participation to the greatest extent possible relative to our means, we begin the important work of transitioning the American economy into the fourth industrial revolution. Many will argue it's incredibly irresponsible to leave your job in such harrowing economic times, but I think the opposite is true. The most dangerous thing any of us can do right now is tie our futures to such a consistently unreliable system, when the pace of civilizational, technologic, and economic change is accelerating so rapidly, when the future itself will be filled with so many new disruptions, challenges, dangers, and opportunities. We don't know what kind of new technologies are going to completely change everything the way social media and the internet did over the last 20 years. A study from Oxford thinks that automation could take as many as 45% of all jobs. Drivers, farmers, publishers, cashiers, travel agents, dispatchers, waiters, bartenders, bank tellers, military, telemarketers, fast food workers, accountants, stock traders, construction workers, and even movie stars. Who would have thought? Remember CGI Princess Leia? Pretty soon it's going to be only CGI Princess Leia. This is why Obama and the tech bros are pushing UBI. They're afraid. We don't know what other kind of situations we'll have to deal with, like COVID. There could be another pandemic where we have to stay in lockdown even longer. Severe weather events are increasing in frequency. I lived 15 minutes from Paradise. That town's unemployment rate jumped from 3 to 100% in 12 hours. Foreign wars could disrupt supply chains and cripple businesses here at home. Cyber attacks and data breaches could sow all kinds of chaos and confusion. Pretending it's alarmist nonsense is exactly what you would have said about COVID before that happened. The most important skills in the future will be resourcefulness, inventiveness, and adaptability. The most important skill will be our ability to learn new skills. As I've discussed plenty before, video games are the most valuable training available to anyone right now. The science has made clear they make us more creative problem solvers. They make us faster thinkers. They make us more accurate thinkers. They prevent cognitive decline and increase the amount of gray matter in your brain. Your video games are the ultimate mental workout. When your body's in great shape, you'll be better at every physical activity you engage in, even if it's something you've never done before. You'll be stronger, faster, and have a higher endurance. The same is true for your brain. The mental ability you develop now will aid you when you have to learn some new technology or survive some new global crisis. I genuinely believe every hour you spend playing video games is a more valuable investment in your future than any hour spent in class. I don't think class trains your brain for shit. Otherwise, there wouldn't be such a glaring disparity between those who game and those who don't. Everyone's been doing nothing but classrooms for 100 years, and where's it gotten us? If classrooms worked, we wouldn't be in the pickle we're in now. I think class trains you to get good at memorizing things and following instructions. I think our problems as a country are the result of our being led by a generation of teachers' pets who don't know how to solve a problem when they don't have a piece of paper telling them how to solve it. So they just shit their pants and hope for the best. Right now, some of you are listening to this in the background of your Zoom class. I want you to look at the top right corner of your screen. There's a big red X button. I want you to go ahead and click that motherfucker right now. Cut every class you can. Burn your homework. Cast it into the flames. And they'll tell you it's reckless and irresponsible, but just remember what's happening to the generation that preceded you. Over the last few months, tens of millions have filed for unemployment. In response, the White House began a Find Something New jobs program where Ivanka Trump helps people, and I quote, learn a completely new skill because COVID is an opportunity for a new trajectory in their lives. This is the government putting the most positive spin it can on a dark truth. Most of the jobs people lost during this crisis aren't coming back ever. Most of the people losing their jobs will have to start from scratch at the bottom of some new industry, some new company. If these jobs come at all, they will come in the middle of our 5th recession in 2 decades. They are certain to pay less than the jobs they are replacing. The workers themselves, having dedicated most of their productive hours for most of their lives to jobs that no longer exist, developing skills that are no longer relevant, will have less value than ever before to the system. This system will take everything from you, and when it's done, it will discard you. The politicians will say they feel sorry for you, the media will write stories about you, the businessmen will sell you synthetic heroin to make you feel better, but nobody will actually do anything to help you. We are a nation of mercenaries. It is dog eat dog, every man for himself. You know this. This is how it always was. It is our greatest strength and most harrowing weakness. Social Darwinism is the only true God here. You are on your own. Be wary of trusting the conventional wisdom that has led so many others astray. If you want to truly understand the American workers' plight, watch the movie Born on the 4th of July. It documents what it was like to be a Vietnam vet, how as young men there was a tremendous amount of societal pressure to be the American military hero, to serve your country for a higher ideal, how the government portrayed the fight as a noble battle between the forces of good and evil. These belief systems coerced young men by the tens of thousands. They wanted to make the world a better place. They wanted to make mom proud. But society was wrong. And the government was lying. Instead, these men were left traumatized with the things they had done and the things that had happened to them. It didn't take long for everyone to give up on the war, but by then it was too late. We had sunk too much into it to turn back. Nobody wanted to admit we had made a mistake, so we kept at it for years, even after it was so clearly a lost cause. People stopped volunteering, so the system drafted thousands more against their will under threat of imprisonment. But we lost. It was all for nothing. And when the vets got home, they were broken. Psychologically destabilized, limbless, and paralyzed, and the system that had coerced them left them to die. The war's opponents thought they were monsters, the war's advocates couldn't bear to acknowledge them. They became a collective monument to our national shame, to how foolish we had been, to the pain we had caused. They made us sad, we just wanted them to go away. It was their own damn fault, it was their problem, not ours. There was no sympathy, there was no health care, there were no veterans charities or politicians crowing about taking care of vets. They were too disabled to work, so we left them behind. They died on street corners and in hotel rooms, broken and alone, in wheelchairs with catheters, numbed on drugs and alcohol. Today, the exact same thing is happening to another generation of young men who've grown old and are killing themselves in numbers greater than all the lives we lost in the real Vietnam combined. They fought, and these 40 or 50-year-olds must have fought so hard for so long, but no relief ever came, and we just left them there to die alone. And the media will come up with clever alliterative nicknames like Deaths of Despair, and the comedy shows will make fun of the pharma execs who got them hooked on heroin before they died, and the politicians will say they can save you in exchange for a vote, but nobody will actually do anything. American capitalism has become its own Vietnam. Like Vietnam, victory is always right around the corner. It's more money, a new car, it's a bigger house, it's that next promotion. Like Vietnam, victory never comes, because these things can't make you happy. The data tells us this, the people who've actually gotten that stuff tell us this. Like Vietnam, there's a great deal of cultural pressure and government strong-arming to participate exactly the way they tell you, even if it's not actually in your best interests. And like Vietnam, you will be left wounded. Pain is not weakness leaving the body. Pain is your body telling you it is sustaining damage. This is as true for pain in your mind and heart as it is your body. To fix this pain, we engage in self-destructive behavior, addiction, negligence, infidelity, and end up only feeling worse. Anger is a chemical response to pain, and unsurprisingly, a deep, ungovernable rage has manifested itself throughout all American society. We believe mistakenly that everything would be better if we could just destroy the people who don't think like us. And all the meanwhile, we can't shed the true source of our pain, our fucking jobs, because then everyone would think we were irresponsible losers, and we can't even work less, because that would mean buying less things, and then they'll start cutting jobs, because everything we buy justifies somebody else's survival. Because if as a society, we stopped rapidly replacing our cars, clothes, and furniture every couple of years, if companies built their products to last, if we tried to make our products last, most of the country would have starved to death by now. We dedicate most of our lives to a job, building skills for an industry, and one day a virus or a new technology will come along and wipe the industry out, and the only things we are good at will be irrelevant, and we will be left crippled just as if we were in a wheelchair, useless to the system. Because our lives do not have value if we do not have something to trade. And like Vietnam, the system will discard us. They will repo our cars, evict us from our homes, and liquidate our assets down to the clothes on our back to pay off the predatory student loan debts we aren't allowed to declare bankruptcy on. Just like in 08, just like right now. We are at this very moment sowing the seeds for the next wave of deaths of despair. One thing everything agreed on in 2016 was that Trump's election was an expression of rage. Everyone was like, wow, Trump voters are really pissed off. And Trump voters were like, yeah, we're really pissed off. Commentators were calling it, and I quote, a primal scream of rage. And what was most remarkable about that was that the bulk of his support came from the elderly, from the boomers. The boomers who came up when the economy was actually doing really well. So remember, if you want to be like them, if you want to end your life screaming in primal rage, go ahead and do it how they did it. Go to school, get a job, work hard, build your 401k. Or we could try something else. It was Churchill who knew us best when he said Americans always do the right thing once they've tried everything else first. Well, this whole hereditary oligarchy consumer capitalism thing has been a lot of fun. Sorry it didn't work out, but it's time to move the fuck on. The COVID crisis is forcing a reckoning that this country has put off for far too long. We talk mad shit about how we have the best system, glad 300 million people spent the last 60 years building a system that was brought to its knees by a dead bat who ate its own shit on the other side of the world. Pour one out for the system, ladies and gentlemen. Sure, I'm gonna miss this bullshit, not. The Spanish flu, both world wars, the Great Depression, all these things laid bare the profound weaknesses of the systems in practice at the time, resulting in profound societal and cultural changes. Monarchies were overthrown and replaced. Robber barons were brought to heel. The UN was established, and America got its New Deal. I wish positive change could occur in a vacuum, but history makes it clear we have to be prodded to it by misery like the stubborn bastards we are. So be it. Our current system should have been undone by Vietnam or by 9/11 and the Iraq War scandal. It should have been undone by the Great Recession, but like a cockroach colony, it persists. It has gotten stronger, smarter. It knows how to weather a storm. We must not let it weather this one. It defies any basic understanding of morality, that millions of people are going to suffer so profoundly because a system they have no control over got pulverized by a problem they had nothing to do with. It makes the blood boil that the oligarchs who control the government, who bear the most responsibility for this whole thing, are made stronger and safer by the crisis, while regular people bear the brunt of their incompetence. This is the kind of profound injustice that used to inspire revolution. But we aren't even talking about it. Because the Unabomber spoke true, they're getting better at controlling our minds. Instead of taking a critical look at the system destroying us, what are we doing? We're getting in Facebook arguments. Oh, cause well, she said this and she got fired, and it's hypocritical cause one time he said that and he didn't get fired, and these two were on their lawn and that really intimidated me, and this other person was cussing someone out in a parking lot, and they tore down a statue in Boston that I didn't even know existed, but I'm still really sad about it, and Nick Cannon talks shit about white people and it hurt my feelings so bad, and now I'm worried the Black Panthers are gonna hunt me down. Let me tell you something right now. Facebook arguments have a 0% success rate of changing anyone's mind about anything. It is emotionally stunted adults having temper tantrums about things that don't actually even affect them and which they have no control over. I'm not judging. This used to be me. But then something crazy happened. I grew the fuck up. This may blow your mind, but there are 350 million people in this country and another 7 billion around the world. Every day for the rest of your life, there will be people getting into arguments and altercations. People will be unfair and rude and racist and unreasonable and say dumb shit, and there will be fistfights, and people will break the law and get arrested by cops who abuse their power. You getting personally involved in every single one of those altercations accomplishes nothing. Go bash your head into the wall for a few hours. It will be just as productive a use of your time and will do less damage to your mental health and that of others. Facebook encourages these arguments because controversial content drives user engagement and they make a shitload of money off of all the ads you are subconsciously processing while you own a 12-year-old in Canada about the dangers of cultural appropriation. The politicians encourage these culture wars because it keeps their voters loyal. The goal is to fill you with enough nihilistic contempt that you'll let them shit in your mouth as long as the other side has to smell it. To make you so afraid of the other side that you'll cover for all your own side's bullshit. Because whatever their flaws, they'll keep you safe from the other half of the country that wants to fuck you to death. And most importantly, it means they are never put in the uncomfortable position of having to choose between the diametrically opposed interests of their voters and their donors. The oligarchs profit financially and are shielded politically by your Facebook arguments. Whatever good you think you may be doing, I assure you, it's not worth the cost. They have stuck a 12-inch dildo into your brain and they are laughing at you while you lose your mind. The COVID crisis, the next 2 years of recession may be our last best chance for reform. We cannot afford to blow it on brainwashed Facebook battles. Maybe you'll get someone fired from the other side, maybe you'll raise attention for an important issue, and guess what? Nothing will change. Just like nothing significant has changed in the last 10 years, despite all the crazy social media wars we've gotten into in that time. The day-to-day suffering that we all face will continue. Our cage will remain intact. Instead, we should seize this moment to build something new. The match has already begun. It will last about the next 2 years, during which time we're going to be in a recession. The oligarch's goal is to herd everyone back into work and school as quickly as possible, to pretend this was a blip in the system so that we all move on without thinking about it too much or addressing the systemic change we obviously need. Our goal is not to let that happen. Our goal is to make it clear we aren't going back to how things were, that the system failed us miserably and we have no desire to give it a second go, nor are we obliged to. The oligarchs' go-to strategy beyond the culture wars will be shame. They will argue we shouldn't feel sorry for millions of misplaced workers because they are lazy and deserve this shit. They will argue that we can't help them because then it will be harder for their employers to put them back on the leash. Don't let it happen. I speak now directly to all you hard workers out there, all you big believers in the value of hard work and personal responsibility. I want you to take all your hard work and blow it out your fucking ass, you stupid morons. You have broken the country. Your hard work is for nothing. While you were busy working hard, you forgot to tend to your civic duties, you big dumb fucks. You forgot to use your goddamn brain for anything besides the production of stupid crap that nobody even needs. Your hard work fanaticism is just another bullshit ego trip to make yourself feel good by putting others down. You are Agent Smith. You are Uncle Tom. You are subservient clowns that the oligarchs use to advance their most destructive propaganda, that people should blame themselves for their precarious economic conditions instead of questioning the system. Your ability to produce capital makes you as special, wise, and unique as my ability to take a shit makes me. There is one other key difference researchers have found between those who game and those who don't. Gamers have a greater sense of morality. We are made more ethical, more altruistic by our games. They have taught us empathy and community, two things which have no place in the dog-eat-dog capitalism we practice in the real world and are thus in such short supply. We know there is a greater calling in this life than struggling for our personal consumption of resources and capital. There is a beautiful world here, filled with wonderful people. It is worth fighting for. The hour grows late, the night dark. The enemies of liberty and equality grow stronger. Nihilism runs rampant through the streets. The oligarchy is all-powerful, but we've all run the simulations. They're tough, but they're not invincible. This country was born in chaos, and to chaos we return. All the better, for it is in chaos that America thrives. Our greatest mistake was letting the teachers' pets poison us with their goodly brain words so they could make everything all neat and organized, predictable and weak, homogeneous and vulnerable. We let the American people grow soft and afraid of the unknown. When the Pilgrims left England, when generations of immigrants left their homelands all around the world, when cowboys came west to manifest destiny and American slaves threw off their chains, they were all driven by a desire to create their own lives, to reject systems that exploited them, to shed the predetermined rules, requirements, and beliefs that others had bound them to. Our forefathers understood that when a conflict arises between the individual and the system, it is the system that must break, or otherwise be left behind. Never were these the easier lives to choose. By all accounts, it was more dangerous, required harder work and greater sacrifice than had they stayed. There was pain, there was loss, but there was also hope, triumph, and adventure. They lived full lives that to this day we tell each other stories about. Their struggles won a better world, for their children, for their children's children, and for every one of us to walk the earth since then. The new frontiers that we must conquer, for our descendants, are not geographical locations. They are new ways of thinking, new ways of producing, new ways of living. We must find these new frontiers. We must conquer them. To those whose circumstances have left them no way out, I say this. Hang in there. Hold the line. No man left behind. Change is in the air, and when we look at the news today, it is easy to be afraid. But I am not afraid. I am excited. Because the only thing worse than the unknown is the known, and everything is going exactly according to plan. Because the patterns of history are not a flat line. They are a series of great upheaval and transitions, and no matter how difficult and frightening these transitions may be, always on the other side is a better world. There is a light at the end of this tunnel. Many people wonder what the point of life is. I think it is rather obvious. We are meant to enjoy our lives, to flourish, and to strive for others' joy and flourishment as well. This is the natural standard most people live by when they don't overthink it too much. We ease into a natural cycle of enjoying ourselves and laboring so that the fruits of our labor might contribute to others' joy. Because fittingly, the greatest joys are often found in making yourself useful to your fellow man. The point to life is children's laughter, McFlurries, jacuzzis, orgasms. The point to life is others enjoying the song you wrote, the house you built, and the food you made, the security you provided, the functionality you created. In this way, like every other system in nature, we form a self-sustaining, perfect cycle. But our current system makes that cycle impossible. The purpose of life is incompatible with modern education and economic systems. In the new world, life will be valued simply because it is life. I don't care if they are the laziest, dumbest, fattest fucks in human history. They will live. If they never lift a finger for anyone else, they will live. God damn it, I give zero fucks about what is fair. There is life and there is death. I prefer the former and will not cede an inch to the latter, even if it's the fairest fucking thing on earth. Only then will we know love. Love of others, love of ourselves, love of country, love of life. To prioritize our economic production in the absence of these things is to gloat about our KDs while we lose the match. And in the meantime, my fellow gamers, game on. And do not be dissuaded by the haters, be they the brainwashed, responsible people who've run this country into the ground, or the poisoned voices in your head they've planted there. Embrace the game, embrace the joys, embrace your friends and play and see every new world and meet every new challenge and bask in the ambiance of your own humanity. And do not be content with misery. Do not be content to sell most of the hours of your life to others who don't even pretend to appreciate it. Do not let the system break you. Do not feel beholden to boredom in cold, lifeless classrooms and offices. For that is no life worth living at all. Your heart is free, bitch! Thanks for watching. This is Batman, signing out.
Gas is moving in. New safe zone location.
Oh.